Welcome to another edition of Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, your host. Today we're talking about whether it's true that there's no evidence for God. The guests joining me today are Dr. Josh Rasmussen and TJump. Dr. Josh Rasmussen, he's a good friend of mine. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. His area of expertise is in analytic metaphysics with a focus on the foundations of existence and the philosophy of mind. He is author of Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, Necessary Existence with Alexander Proust, The Bridge of Reason, and most recently, How Reason Leads to God. TJump has made sort of a splash in the apologetic scene pretty quickly. He's debated a lot of apologists, a lot of Christian thinkers, even someone like Luke Barnes, who's a cosmologist. He's written a book on epistemology, and now he's testing his arguments against various Christian thinkers. So it's great to have you guys both on. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. So
Thank you.
And like I mentioned, Tom, I really need to get one of those recliners. That looks like the most comfortable chair on the planet.
I totally agree. It is. I think it's fantastic. I got it discounted. It's actually a really expensive chair. I got it like 30%.
Does it like have hands that come out and massage you, or what?
Unfortunately not. It would be that's a extra feature for more money.
That's an add-on. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you want to learn more about my guests, just go to our website, capturingchristianity.com. If you're new to the channel, we posted a couple of videos recently, and we've gotten a whole lot more subscribers to our channel. So if you're new here, we host live discussions like this about once a month, and we have a lot of stuff planned coming up. So make sure that if you are enjoying this content, like the videos, subscribe to our channel. And we don't just have a YouTube channel. We actually have a website and a podcast. Both can be found at our website, capturingchristianity.com. Also follow us on all of our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, Instagram, all the good stuff. All right, let's jump right into the discussion. We don't take a lot of time here for introduction. So tonight's topic, like I said, is there really no evidence for God's existence? And since Tom is answering this question in the affirmative, I think it's best that we give him the floor to start this out. And again, these are informal discussions, so this isn't really a debate. We're just talking out loud, thinking out loud, trying to work with each other and work through some of these issues. All right, so Tom, thanks again for coming on, and go ahead and take the floor. Whatever, yeah.
Well, thanks for having me. I'd like to start with my normal introduction. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there's any reason, evidence, or arguments that indicate the existence of a God. And could you, Josh, tell me some of the reasons that you believe there are for belief in a God, and then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons. And then I'd just like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Yeah, sure. That would be great. I was thinking maybe first we could talk about evidence, and then we could think through how evidence could apply to worldview. So since you define atheism in terms of not having reasons, or there are no reasons for God, I thought it'd be good just to kind of clarify. So would you say then that somebody who thinks God does not exist, but thinks that there are some evidence that sort of supports the existence of God, wouldn't count as an atheist on your definition?
I would probably class them as an agnostic.
Okay. What if they are pretty sure that God does not exist?
Well, I find it very strange if they actually believe there were reasons to believe in a God, but believe there wasn't one. I have not met a lot of people who hold that position.
So I have friends, many friends who have this view. So it's kind of like balancing the arguments and the reasons. And some of them just tell me that although there is evidence, maybe it's very slight on the side of theism, but then the overwhelming evidence just, makes them nearly sure that God does not exist, or, more sure. So I'm just trying to clarify the term. So, on your definition, they would count as not atheists.
Right. I'd probably just class them as agnostic.
Okay.
My position is stronger than that because I want to make the positive claim there is absolutely no evidence for a God, because I'm trying to gain that burden of proof.
Yes. So now let's say there was someone who believes in God, and then they also agreed with your claim. So they think God exists, but they don't think their belief in God comes through evidence somehow. This isn't me, but they would count as an atheist on your account.
In regards to the evidence, yes. So I'd class it as like methodological.
Even though they believe in God, they say God exists, they still count as an atheist.
Well, I make the distinction between methodological atheism and metaphysical atheism. Like the methodological position, meaning there's no reason to believe, versus the metaphysical position, there is no God. So there's two different classes there. They would be the methodological kind of like a methodological naturalist. You can be a methodological naturalist without assuming there is no supernatural.
Right.
So it's the same kind of distinction.
Yes. So I think it's just good to get these clear, because I mean, the claim that X exists is very different from the claim that evidence for X exists. So somebody could think evidence for X exists, but think that X does not. Someone can think that X does exist, but that evidence for X does not exist. So they're sort of miles apart. And so that's why I kind of thought it'd be good to sort of start by talking a bit about evidence, making some distinctions. And I have some questions about evidence that I think that you'll be sympathetic with, but I think this will sort of help us before we even look at candidate evidence for a particular worldview. So one distinction I was thinking about was evidence for an individual mind versus standard of evidence is for a community of minds. And the thought here is that there's a difference. So, for example, I have this belief. I don't know how I got this belief, but I have this belief that I had some coffee this morning. I guess I do kind of know how I got the belief, but there's no peer-reviewed scientific papers about this event. Would you say that I have sort of an adequate justification for my belief, even if there's not sort of evidence that meets the standard of community evidence for the belief that I had coffee this morning?
Yes, I would believe that is a justified belief to hold.
Okay, good. Yes, because I think this is important because oftentimes I hear people talk about evidence we have, and it seems to me that there are arguments that could weigh in someone's mind that gives that person evidence, even if that evidence won't count as evidence that we have as a community. So it could be that in the end, we could end up agreeing that there's no evidence that we have for the existence of God or some grand claim, even if the vast majority of people who have the belief in God are justified in their belief on the evidence that they have. Would that be agreeable to you?
Not necessarily. So I'd class evidence into essentially three kinds: conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. So conceptual claims are claims about things that exist in our head, just things we imagine. Then empirical claims are claims that we can verify as existing in the apparent world that we experience around us. That's like scientific claims. And then metaphysical claims are claims about the fundamental first principles of reality, the absolutes, the indefeasibles, where there's nothing more beyond it. And each of these, like conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. And so if you don't have evidence of the tier of the claim that you're making, then I would consider it to be unjustified. So if you're making a claim about a God, like an all-powerful being that wasn't created, then you would need some kind of metaphysical evidence to justify that claim. Your personal experience or your personal testimony would not be sufficient. That would only justify the conceptual conclusion that there's this thing in your imagination, essentially.
Okay, so we can explore that further. Just one more distinction I think that you might resonate with that's very helpful for kind of framing our conversation is the difference between evidence that you have versus the evidence you're able to know that you have. So for example, this morning I was just like asking my kids about my hands, and I asked them if my hands were their hands. Is this hand your hand? So I started with the 4-year-old. She didn't know. She's like, I don't know. So I went to the 6-year-old, and then she said, no, that this hand is not my hand. I said, are you sure? She said, yes, I'm sure. How do you know? She said she didn't know how she knew. So she wasn't able to articulate any evidence. Then I went to the 10-year-old and I asked him, how do you know that this hand is not your hand? And so his response, he thought about it, he said, well, I don't have control over your hand. And then I said, well, but do you have control over your heart? And he said, well, I don't. I mean, not direct control. And so then we continued to argue back and forth, and I pretty much just challenged him to give me some good evidence that this wasn't his hand. And refute my arguments. And what we saw through these experiments was that it's much, much harder to identify the evidence that you have than it is to actually have evidence. So to illustrate this just a little bit further, I would actually argue that one bit of evidence that somebody has evidence is that they actually have a belief. So for example, you could worry that maybe somebody is psychologically motivated and it's not actually evidence behind their belief. So for example, like right now I have a psychological motivation to believe that I have a gold bar in my hand. Like I think that would be really cool to have just a big gold bar, but I don't know how to believe that, right? And so the desire doesn't really let me get to that belief. But how would I come to believe that there's a gold bar here? Well, it seems that I would have to have some kind of experience that indicates to me that there really is probably a gold bar. Maybe I have an experience of a gold bar. Now, again, this evidence may not be available to everybody else. And again, I may not be able to defend that I actually have evidence of the gold bar. But the very fact that I would have the belief in the gold bar, I think would be evidence. It'd be a bit of evidence that I have some evidence. I'm curious what you think about this, that beliefs could be evidence of evidence.
Well, I would just apply it to misconceptions, misunderstandings, delusions, illusions, all of these kinds of things. If I granted your premise, then the belief I see this illusion moving on a piece of paper is evidence that it's moving. So I would kind of reject that as a plausible grounds of evidence.
Sure. So you could have misleading evidence, right? So you could have evidence that indicates a belief that's false, but doesn't mean that you actually don't have evidence, right? I mean, so you agree, right, that you can have evidence that's misleading.
Right, but I would say that in order to have evidence that the position is true, you need to actually filter out those false things. Because if you have evidence, that doesn't mean you have evidence it's true, you just have evidence of something.
Okay, well, evidence of something is something, right?
Right, but so in my position is there's no evidence of a God. You can still have evidence of something. Like I grant that there has to be a necessary thing to ground all of existence. And there's plenty of evidence of that, but none of it actually indicates a God from my perspective. So the fact that you have evidence isn't evidence of a God. For that, you need to rule out the alternatives.
Yeah, so I just want to think about ruling out the alternatives. So I think it's also helpful to distinguish between some evidence versus sufficient evidence. Do you think that you could have some evidence that doesn't rule out the alternatives? It's not sufficient.
Depends on what you mean. Like, I don't believe there is any, but it's definitely possible.
So, like, for example, let's say that you're in a game show and there's 4 doors and they're labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's a 10% chance that there's a prize behind door 1, 20% chance there's a prize behind door 2, 30%, 40%. There's a bigger prize if it happens to be behind the less probable one. And so now you're invited to figure out, which door you get to guess. And so you try door 1, you open it up and you see the prize isn't there. Now you get another guess, okay? Would you say that seeing that the prize wasn't behind door 1, you know that it's behind one of the 4 doors, does that give you some evidence that it's behind door 2?
Well, give me some evidence that's behind one of the other doors and not the door I opened.
Does it give you some evidence that it's behind each of the other doors?
Any of them, but I don't think it gives me any evidence of any of them particularly.
Okay. So watch this. Let's say you open up the second door. Okay. Now you see that one, there's nothing behind there. So now you've eliminated the 10% and the 20%. Okay. So now you've got 3 doors left. Those percentages now go up, right?
Yes.
And what was previously 40% is now higher than 50%, right? Even though you haven't ruled out door 3. And so then my thought is that by seeing that there's nothing behind doors 1 and 2, now you have some evidence for door 4, even though you haven't ruled out door 3.
Right, I grant that.
Okay.
So because it has a higher percentage than door 3. There's a higher percentage on one than the other.
Okay. And before you open up door 2, would you say you had evidence for 3 and 4? Again, clarifying that some evidence isn't the same as sufficient evidence. So it doesn't have to be over 50%.
Yeah, so if there's just more percentage on one conclusion than another, then I would count that as evidence of the other one that has more percentage.
Right. Good. So then what about the thought that a belief is itself a bit of evidence that the person has evidence?
Well, I'd go back to the illusion example. There's no more reason to believe that this belief they have is true than false purely off the fact they have a belief. So it doesn't raise the probability one way or the other. It could still be false equally as well. It could be true, and it's probably more likely false given our experience of the human mind and beliefs.
So your thought is that beliefs aren't even a tiny bit of evidence that the person got that belief through some sort of sense that indicated the truth of something. It's not even a bit of evidence, not even a small bit. We're not talking about sufficient evidence here.
Well, it depends on the claim. Like if I said, I believe that I am seeing something right now, I believe I am talking to a screen, well, that would just be true by the fact that I have the belief. So in that sense, it would be evidence of the beliefs that I'm holding. So if I have a belief of something I'm seeing, that's true by definition. So I'm totally fine to grant that would be sufficient evidence to grant the conclusion that I have this belief.
Okay.
But it wouldn't necessarily, it depends, like if you're making a belief about something existing in the world, then the fact that you have the belief would not be sufficient. You would need something more than that. You need an empirical basis from my perspective.
Sure, well, I agree it's not sufficient, or that it's also not necessary. Well,
right, I count it as nothing. It's nothing.
It's nothing. It's not even. All right, so let me try this. You believe that the pixels that you're seeing there's some kind of mind behind those pixels. Do you believe that?
Yes, that you have a mind, yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Like, what would you say is your evidence for that?
I have an implicit empirical basis of other people. There's lots of scientific evidence we have of people. And so the fact that I have an experience of what I see to be a person also has support of that other empirical evidence, the background knowledge of people existing empirically in the world and meeting those tests of that scientific evidence. And so I'm going to apply that evidence to you and say that you have both the empirical basis of science as well as the support of my personal testimony of seeing you.
Okay, so here's another explanation of the pixels. Inside of Cameron's left ear, there's just a kind of law that generates these pixels. How do you rule that out?
Well, there's no reason to believe, there's no empirical evidence to support that conclusion. There is empirical evidence to support that people exist and that you are a person. There's no empirical evidence to support that there is a law inside of Cameron's ear, as far as I know.
So I'm trying to figure out how you're thinking that the empirical evidence supports that there's a mind behind these pixels today at this moment, over and against this alternative explanation. Like, how are you ruling that out?
Well, let me give you my classical example. Like if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. The difference between these two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis. I mean, there's lots of stuff that we've done scientific testing on dogs, like their taxonomy, their phylogeny, their chemical composition, genetic makeup, their training, all of these things. We have tons and tons of empirical evidence that's implicit in this statement, dog, that doesn't exist for unicorns. We have no empirical evidence of unicorns. So the conceptual evidence of my testimony combined with the implicit empirical evidence of the dogs makes the statement I saw a dog reasonable to accept, because it has both the empirical evidence along with the conceptual testimony.
Yeah,
the conceptual testimony of a unicorn, because it does not have an empirical basis, is unreasonable to believe. So the fact that I see you on a screen is like the claim I saw a dog, I see a person. So all of the implicit empirical evidence of persons that we have scientific evidence for applies to you, just like the statement I saw a dog. But the law would be like the unicorn. We don't have any empirical evidence for the law existing in Cameron's ear, so I can reject that just like I would reject a unicorn. It doesn't have an empirical basis.
Can I just ask one clarifying question? So we had, you mentioned these different types of evidences, right? You talked about conceptual. I actually need to write these down. Conceptual,
empirical,
and metaphysical, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what are these types? What's the evidence? What's the distinction here?
So conceptual is just stuff in your head, stuff you can imagine or think about, personal experience, intuition.
So these would be mental states.
Yes. And then empirical would be things that we can verify through testable novel predictions, the scientific method, essentially. Those are scientific kinds of evidence. And then metaphysical would just be...
So wait, let me back up here. So empirical evidence is what?
Empirical evidence is scientific, testable, verifiable, falsifiable, novel testable predictions, scientific evidence.
Okay. Is that incompatible with like a mental state?
No, it's just verified mental states. You have an idea in your head, and then you want to show that idea isn't just something in your head. You have to make future testable predictions about things in the world. And if you can verify those, then there's reason to believe that those aren't just things in your head, and they do actually correspond to something in the world.
Okay. All right. And metaphysical is?
Like absolute certainty, the fundamental nature of reality. Like I don't really think we have anything that qualifies as this other than just I think, therefore I am.
Okay. So something that is... 100, like incorrigible is another way of saying it.
Well, incorrigible just means it can't be imagined to be otherwise. So I wouldn't necessarily grant that. But
so any belief that is infallible.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay. But these are all mental states, right?
What do you mean?
So metaphysical, you're talking about like beliefs, or these are still things going on. If you have like absolute certainty, that's still like a mental state.
Right. Well, it would have to be about, you'd have to have the mental state that corresponds to evidence of something about the fundamental nature of reality. So the claim, a metaphysical claim, is claiming something that is true about the fundamental nature of reality. So it's not just a mental state. You need evidence to be a mental state
about. It's a mental state about something else.
Right. Right.
But it's still a mental state.
Right. We have to have an idea in our head that corresponds to the fundamental nature of reality.
Okay. So these are all mental states.
Well, everything is a mental state. It has to be to have a belief.
Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify. I don't know if that helps any of this, but all right, Josh, back to you.
Well, it does help, because one thing I think we might agree on is that, well, tell me if I'm right about this, that evidence comes through our senses.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remembered why I was even asking this. So I think what this might help with is, Josh, going back to your ear analogy or example or whatever it is. Like I suppose you could explain like all of your experiences, your empirical experiences. You could still explain that with the ear, you know, because they're all mental states.
Right. All of them. Yeah, that,
Right.
that would be my next point or question, I guess. I mean, I just want to make sure I'm clear. I'm not disagreeing with you about Cameron's ear. Like I don't actually think it is probable that his ear is the cause of these pixels. Um, but I'm just getting clear, well, what would be our reason for that, right? And again, this goes back to the big difference between having evidence and knowing what evidence you have. I mean, this is why philosophers have very big disagreements about even what evidence we have of the external world. And this is an ongoing inquiry. We haven't come to a consensus on the answer to this. I have a theory about it. You have a theory about it. But it's not like, my children are mistaken or unjustified in believing in the external world until they can get the peer-reviewed science or identify the criteria. And so I just want to make sure that that point is clear. And I'm trying to really get clear even just how your principle works in terms of, I think it's a good principle, but I want to clarify it because it looks to me, and help me see what I'm missing here. It looks to me that we can account for all the empirical data just as well on the ear hypothesis. Maybe it says sort of pantheistic ear hypothesis. Some people talk about naturalistic pantheism. Let's talk about ear pantheism. There's a sort of law built into the ear. Maybe this ear actually has existed at the foundation of things. It's produced things. And maybe Cameron was born without the ear, and then the ear just sort of came into Cameron, maybe when he was 4 years old. It just had a desire to do that. And it would explain, everything else. Maybe there's no mind here behind the pixels except for Cameron's ear doing all the work. And, we both agree that that's not probable, but I'm sort of struggling to see sort of like what future testable prediction, kind of what's your evidence? How do you rule that out?
Well, it would have to make future testable predictions to show it's not just imaginary, because there are infinitely many ways to explain everything. And the way we show that one is a reasonable belief about what actually exists is that that one can be used to make future testable predictions that are verified. So we have future testable predictions that have been made about other people doing stuff and dogs and things. We don't have any future testable predictions about this law in Cameron's ear or unicorns. So I can reject those as just imaginary because they have not met the burden of proof of empirical evidence of making future testable predictions. So we only have reason to believe they're imaginary. We have no reason to believe they actually exist in the world. Whereas we do have reason to believe other people exist. We do have reason to believe dogs exist because those have made future testable predictions. We have lots of future testable predictions of scientific evidence of those things.
So I just want to distinguish two claims here. Right? So one claim is that that we don't have any reason to think that his ear is the uncaused cause. That's one claim. And then the other claim is that we don't have any good reason to think it isn't. And I hear you saying that it is. Like, would you say it probably isn't? I mean, that's a belief. Like, you and I are believers about his ear not being the uncaused cause. We are together believers on the same side. But what's your evidence for that belief?
Right. So there's infinitely many ways to explain anything. And we have to show one of these is more reasonable to believe than the other, because presumably all of them except one are imaginary. Probably only one truth, unless you have some kind of strange non-standard logic. And so they all start as imaginary. Everything starts as imaginary. And then you have to meet some burden of proof to show this one is not just imaginary. It's reasonable to believe. Until then, it's just imaginary. Everything is just imaginary. And then if you can use it to make testable predictions, we then have reason to believe it's not just imaginary. It's met the burden of proof. And we now have a justifiable reason to believe in this thing. So everything just starts as imaginary. It's all imaginary. The law.
When you say imaginary, you mean it's all false? Like you believe it's all false?
Right. It's just something in your head. This doesn't correspond to anything in reality. It's just an imaginary thing, like unicorns.
But you think it's true that it's not his ear. So let me try a different example. So there's an even number of fundamental particles. That's a hypothesis. There's an odd number of fundamental particles. That's a different hypothesis. Would you say that those are both false?
Well, I'd say they're both imaginary. We've just come up with them. We have no reason to believe one over the other. So we'd have to actually show one of them corresponds to reality in some sense.
Can we say anything about probability? Can we say anything like one of them is less likely than the other?
I have no idea if we can say that or not. If there's evidence, yes. If there's not evidence, no.
Okay, so it seems to me, now we might disagree on this. So it seems to me that we can say that it's unlikely that Cameron's ear is the uncaused cause. We can say that that's unlikely. Would you, I mean,
Well, yeah, I can just say it's imaginary until proven otherwise. So I can just say no until you give me evidence otherwise.
so when you say no, I mean, I guess I do kind of want to pin you down a little bit, because we have a lot of agreement. We both agree that Cameron's ear isn't the uncaused cause. We both agree it's sort of an imaginary, hypothesis that we came up with. And we can try to test that hypothesis, but it's hard to see like how to test it, because it explains all the data, right? We can posit all these laws that explain all the data. And yet we both think that the hypothesis is not, we're not just agnostic about it. It's not like we have no reason one way or the other. We think it's probably false. And I'm just wondering like how you might justify on your system that it's probably false.
Well, again, so my tier starts off as conceptual claims require conceptual evidence. You've only presented conceptual evidence, so it's reasonable to make the conclusion it's a conceptual claim. This is just something in your head. There's no reason to believe it's anything more than that. So we have met the burden of proof that this is a conceptual thing. You have imagined it. Now, in order to say it's anything more than that, you would need to provide more evidence. You need to provide empirical evidence to show it's part of the world, or metaphysical evidence to show it's the fundamental necessary thing. But until then, it's met the criteria that it's imaginary. It hasn't met the criteria for anything more than that. So I can just say it's imaginary because it's met that criteria.
And you could also say it's unlikely, just to make sure we're on the same page here.
I'm pretty sure those are the same thing. I mean, if I understand you correctly, I'm saying I think those are the same thing. So until it meets the criteria of
the example of the even particles and odd particles, because those are also imaginary. But I wouldn't say they're both unlikely. In fact, it seems if you say even versus not even, I mean, it seems like those are sort of like by difference, sort of equally unlikely, 50-50, right? Whereas Cameron's ear seems like more unlikely than an even number of particles.
Right. That's because we have an empirical basis for particles. We know particles exist. So it's probably going to be the case, or essentially necessarily going to be the case, there is either an even or an odd number. It has an empirical basis. So then you would have to provide more evidence to one way or the other.
But so do you see what I'm trying to point out, that we can have empirically equivalent hypotheses and still rank the sort of prior probabilities, that even with empirically equivalent hypotheses, they're not just sort of all equally improbable. Some will be more probable than others.
Well, I would say your first isn't an empirical hypothesis. It's a conceptual hypothesis. All you've presented is your idea that there is this law. Whereas the second hypothesis, there is even and odd particles. Both of those have empirical basis. We have empirical evidence for particles. So those do have, and that is an empirical conclusion. Whereas your statement about the law is purely conceptual. There's no empirical evidence of that at all.
Okay, so let me try this. The particles are shaped like Cameron's ear. So we agree there are particles. We don't have evidence of it being even or odd. We don't have evidence of its shape. And my thought is that some shapes are going to be less likely than others. Like,
well, I would say until you provide empirical evidence of the shape, I'm just going to say, nope, that's imaginary too.
I agree. And unlikely, not just 50%, right?
Well, I'm an absolutist here. I'm saying it's either conceptual, empirical, metaphysical. It's one of these three. There's no probabilities. It's one of these three. So if it's conceptual, it's just in your head. Show it's other. Until you show otherwise, it's imaginary. It's 100% just imaginary.
Yeah, I mean, so are you saying, just to get clear, are you suggesting that the hypothesis, the foundation of existence, is shaped like an ear, is a conceptual claim?
Yes, it's just something in your head as far as I can tell. Or it's a metaphysical claim. You're claiming there's something fundamental about the reality, but all you have is conceptual evidence.
Okay, yeah, so it's a claim about ultimate reality. And we have good evidence, I would say, of it being false, right? I think we can agree to that. Unlike if we claim that fundamental reality has sort of an even number of smallest parts, I don't think we have evidence that that's false. Like, there's a difference there, even though they're empirically equivalent. And it has to do with the difference between the hypotheses. So maybe this will help. Let me tell you a little bit more about my view, and you can help me see what I'm missing. It seems to me that empirically equivalent hypotheses can still differ with respect to their prior probability, and that we can see this. Actually, we have a sense of reason that helps us to see this within our own minds. And the sense of reason isn't just the same as the sense of our own minds, because we can have a sense that there are principles of reason that don't depend on our particular thinking. And one of the principles of reason would be that a principle of probability, that if you multiply ad hoc pieces to your hypothesis, like a flying spaghetti monster or sort of arbitrary limits into the foundation of things, you end up decreasing the probability of the hypothesis, even if it's empirically equivalent to other hypotheses. Would that be consistent with your framework? It might help your framework.
Well, I'm happy to grant that, sure.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's progress. Cameron, did you have any?
Oh no, I'm just still listening at this point.
Well, I would go a little further than that. I'd say that the properties of a god are equally or more ad hoc than the properties of the spaghetti monster. I would see those as equally bad. Or probably I'd say the Christian God is probably more complex or more arbitrary than the spaghetti monster, actually.
Yeah, I feel like I appreciate you saying that, because I feel like it's very important to make a comparison. One of the tools that I like to use in philosophy is to let the clear lead you into the unclear. I think sometimes we sort of philosophers will sort of leap into the pit of skepticism where everything's unclear. I think it's good to focus on the clear. That's why I wanted to start with Cameron's ear, because I think it's pretty clear to both of us that not only is that imaginary, but it's very improbable, unlike other hypotheses that are empirically equivalent. And so then what you're pointing out is that from your perspective, the supreme being hypothesis is sort of equally improbable or ad hoc as a flying spaghetti monster hypothesis. And I want to explore that with you, because that's a point where we definitely disagree, but I feel like we might be able to make some progress together by sorting some of the terms and clarifying some things. And so I have an idea for doing that. The idea is to start with a kind of a basic division between two different worldviews. So one worldview has nature prior to reason. And so this is kind of a familiar idea, is that reasoning comes up later in the sort of unfolding of reality. And then the other idea just flips that. The reason is prior in the order of explanation. Maybe you could think of sort of reason infused into the foundation of things. And so here we have like two different views. And if you have the reason coming from non-reason, then all your beliefs, all your reasoning, all your thoughts come ultimately from mindless nonsense, literally. All right. So that's one view. And then another view is that you have a rational foundation. This is sort of a mind first theory. And so this is just a way of cutting between two different theories. And I wonder if you have a way of sort of arguing for one of those over the other.
Well, my understanding of reason and math is that they're descriptive, not prescriptive. So reality is the way reality is, and then reason simply describes that. It's not because it follows the laws of reason or logic. It's just reason and logic simply describe the fact that reality is the way reality is. So I think that would probably fall more in the category of the nature first.
Yeah, okay, so here's a test, future predictable test about the nature of reason. Something that I've noticed is that the principles of reason don't seem to sort of hold their breath for my thinking about them. It's not like the correct answers on a logic exam sort of change on Tuesdays, you know, you just have to know what the correct answers are. And I can sort of check this within my own mind, that I see that, for example, nothing can be both true and false, that's true, but there's a kind of necessity to it, like it couldn't be false. And so since it couldn't be false, then I infer that it doesn't depend on any kind of pattern of thinking in my own mind. And by similar reasoning, meaning it wouldn't depend on any particular pattern in any contingent mind. And so therefore there's a kind of reason permanence, just sort of like object permanence. We can sort of argue for object permanence as the best explanation of our sort of experience with objects. We have a kind of reason permanence. And this would be, it seems to me, to sort of fit better with the sort of reason first hypothesis.
Well, I would say it's just reason is just a reflection of the way reality is. So it's not the fact that reason first describes that the fact that this thing can be only true or false and not both. It's the fact that reality is the way reality is, and it can't not be reality. And then we use logic and reason to simply describe this to be the case. So logic and reason aren't actually governing principles of reality. They're just descriptions of the way reality is. So it seems more reasonable to say that nature is essentially first, because it just is the way nature is. And then we use reason to describe this. It's not the fact that reason is fundamental part of reality.
So help me understand why you're saying nature would come first. Like, what would be sort of future testable prediction?
Well, I just see it as that reason is essentially like a language. Logic and reason are formal languages that are made up by human minds. They're not things that exist in the reality. They're just descriptions of the way things are. And there's lots of disagreement about these things. Like there are non-standard logics, intuitionistic logics, many-valued logics that do reject that there can be one thing that is true and not false. And so because of these, it's really likely that that logic and reason are just human languages that we've made up. And there's disagreement about them. There's different versions of these languages. And they just describe the way reality is. They do not govern reality. They're not prescriptive. They're descriptive.
So yeah, so I mean, I'm sympathetic with the idea that our language allows us to describe this, almost want to call it this sort of reason nature. But the thought is that the reason nature doesn't sort of wait for our thinking about it or wait for our describing it, and that we can actually see that when we actually consider reason itself. Reason is a sort of a light that reveals its own transcendence. For example, 2 + 2 = 4 and cannot equal 6. I mean, don't you have the sense in your own mind that it's not just that 2 + 2 happens to equal 4 today, but that it couldn't fail to equal 4. I mean, we can change our language, right? So we can call it something else. So that's where I'm sympathetic with what you're saying. Because I thought maybe you would want to say that maybe reason is built into the sort of foundation in sort of a naturalistic, pantheistic sort of way. But
well, that's my counter argument to theists, to say, because if you want to say that logic and reason are essentially some kind of fundamental fabric of reality, well, I can just match that and use an equally what I see as ad hoc assertion and just say, well, yeah, okay, they're built in as laws of pantheism. But the most reasonable position from my perspective is that they're not. They're just descriptive. They're just descriptive things that we use to describe reality. Reality is the way reality is. And that's not because they're governed by logic and reason. It's because logic and reason, it's just because that's the way it has to be necessarily. Reality is reality. And then we use logic and reason and math to describe this. So it's not the fact that 2 + 2 couldn't equal 4 because of like our language. It's because that simply just describes the way reality is. Reality couldn't be a different way.
So how would you account for this sort of reason permanence argument?
Well, it's just the permanence of reality, and we're just describing reality. So it seems like reason is the permanent thing, when really it's just reality is the permanent thing, and we're just using something to describe it. So it seems that the language is the permanent thing when it's not.
So my thought is that doesn't quite satisfy the data, because the data isn't just that nature is permanent. It's that nature has a nature that makes it so that it cannot be both A and not A. Like, and that's built into the nature. And that's true of the nature, whether we know it or not. Like before we discovered the laws of logic, right? This is why there's progress in mathematics. There's progress in understanding the sort of light of reason, and we can see more. And it's not that that these things waited for their existence and then sort of randomly. I mean, look, we can test this, okay? Future testable prediction. Every time you consider your thought that 2 + 2 = 4, you're going to see that it has the same kind of necessity. It's unlike, for example, every time you consider an emotion that it's always positive or always negative. That will vary. And that what explains this prediction is the permanence of the nature, which is a reason nature. Because I think what you're saying, what I hear you saying is that there's a descriptive element, and I agree with that. What I'm suggesting is that the descriptive element is of a nature that has reason built into it. And that explains why there's a consistency of our description and of our thought of it.
One thing that I think might help is if we define like what reason, how reason, the term reason is being used here. So, well, yeah. Josh, yeah, how are you using that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm thinking of reason as including all the necessary truths, all the necessary principles. I mean, there's actually a principle of reason that necessary principles are themselves necessarily necessary. And so if necessity entails existence, then it just follows that they're necessarily existent.
And by necessity, you're thinking of like, are you talking about like all possible worlds?
Yeah, they couldn't be otherwise. Yes.
Okay. All right. So Tom, do you disagree with that?
No, I agree fully with what he's saying. The thing is, I'm saying that reason isn't true first. It's nature is first. So reality has a way that reality is, and then reason simply describes that. So it's not reality itself couldn't be contradictory. We're just using reason to describe the fact that it couldn't be contradictory.
Yeah. Well, so what Josh is saying is that the way that he's defining reason is that it's just like encompasses all the necessary truths, right? Is that how you described
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
And so if those are like built into reality, then you would agree that reason is sort of there at the fundamental level.
Right. They could be built into reality, but I'm saying that's probably unlikely. I'm saying reason are purely just descriptions of the way reality is. Reality is a certain way first, nature first. And then reason follows that to simply describe the fact that reality is this way.
So just to clarify, you would say there are no necessary truths.
Well, I'd say necessary
How we
truths.
think of them.
I would say necessary truths describe necessary reality. So it's not true by virtue of the truths. They're just descriptions of reality.
Mm-hmm. So you might reject the S4 axiom that the necessity of a necessary truth is itself necessary.
Well, I'd say it's a necessary reflection of reality. It can't be otherwise, but it's not otherwise because we simply define it to be the case. It can't be otherwise because that's the way reality is.
Okay, so let me try this. Maybe we can make progress along this line. So I think you and I both appreciate a kind of uniformity in our explanation. So here's an argument that we might be sympathetic with jointly. It's a kind of track record argument for a methodological naturalism where we see natural causes. Now, I myself am not quite sure how to define natural, but if natural includes beings like me, beings that can have reason and thoughts and intentions, I have no problem with just taking a uniformity principle and just inferring that probably everything's natural, or at least given our current evidence, everything's natural. And I'm wondering if you would be sympathetic with that, and then if you'd be sympathetic with the parallel argument that probably everything is rationally situated. So we have no examples of anything that's not either part of a mind or part of a product of a mind, but we have many examples of things that are part of a mind or part of a product of a mind. So by uniformity, the foundation of things we could say is natural and rational. So it's a kind of rational naturalism.
Well, I would not say that we have any reason to believe that rationalism is in fact a fundamental part of reality. It's purely a language construct as far as I'm concerned.
So the argument was just exactly the same as the argument for naturalism. It's a kind of a track record argument. So for example, like we see all sorts of things that are rationally situated, things that are built from reason, from thought. We don't have any clear counterexamples of things that aren't. I mean, if you point to, for example, dirt, and you say, well, dirt's not rationally situated, but that's not a clear counterexample because we don't have any evidence that dirt isn't like every other thing that's rationally situated, part of a system that has a reason at the foundation. And you might think that the principles of reason and the laws of physics have a kind of thought-like nature to them. I mean, after all, they have the same structure as our own thoughts. Maybe this is why you say they're descriptive, but the idea is that they're describing natures that exist even when we're not thinking about them. And so it seems to me that if we have evidence of sort of a uniform natural world, we have exactly the parallel evidence for a uniform rational world with a rational foundation. And this would give you a kind of rational naturalism, which in my vocabulary would be a minimal theism, a theism that you might like because it's consistent with, I think, a worldview that I think you're sympathetic with.
Well, I would just say that's like saying that, well, trees are described by words that we come up with, like the English word tree. Therefore, the English word tree is somehow intrinsic to the property of trees. That's essentially what I hear when you make that argument.
Okay, so just to be clear, so this is a different argument, right? So we can separate the argument for the reason permanence, and we can just put that to the side for a moment. I think that we would have to make some more clarifications about S5 logic and S4 logic. But put that to the side. This is just an argument from uniformity. I'm just saying there's a parallel argument. You don't have to think that all your beliefs are based on mindless nonsense. There's a more rational view, which is a view that's based on a kind of uniformity, a track record. Do you have any example of something that's not rationally situated? Can you give any evidence of anything that's not rationally situated?
No, I think that rationality is simply a description of the way reality is. So it's not nonsense. That's just my beliefs are based on the way reality is. And then we use rationality to describe the way it is. So I get the same justification without any kind of nonsense as you do. I just don't assume that rationality is intrinsic. I just assume rationality is descriptive.
Just to be clear, I meant ultimately everything's based on mindless nonsense unless the foundation is rational.
Right, and I reject that. I just say everything is based on reality, and reality is the way reality is.
But you do think reality is mindless nonsense at the foundation.
I believe it's mindless, but it's not nonsense. There's no reason to assume it's nonsense.
It's nonsense. It doesn't have reason, doesn't have rationality.
it has the way reality is the way reality is. So to say
Yeah.
it's nonsense would to say it disconforms with sense. So if you're just saying that we don't have any intrinsic sense to the way reality is.
I got it. What I meant was it doesn't have sense built into it. So
Right.
it's
I would agree. I would agree.
yeah,
It doesn't have
everything's based on
consciousness.
mindless nonsense in that sense. So maybe I could just say it's based on mindlessness.
Yes.
So all your thoughts are based on mindlessness. And what I'm suggesting is that a rational foundation would mirror the sort of track record that naturalism has. So this is a different argument than the descriptive argument.
Well, I would reject that because the vast majority of what we see in nature isn't mindful. Like, for example, planets, particles, not minds. Just minds are a very small portion of reality as far as we can tell with the best evidence we have. And so
what evidence is there that planets aren't rationally situated? That is to say, ultimately based on the product of a mind. What evidence is there for that?
I see there's no reason to conclude that they are based on a mind in any sense. There's no mind anything out there to do it. It's just that's just the way nature is.
So there's different arguments, right? The argument I'm giving here is just the track record argument. Everything we have in experience is rationally situated. I mean, I have to be kind of honest. Like, it seems to me that just if I have to pick two views, one is that all my beliefs are based on mindlessness, and the other is that there's a rational foundation. Just by default, it seems more credible that mindlessness is not going to produce any rational beliefs than a rational foundation would. Just by default, right? It seems like this sort of kind of mindless view is sort of loses sort of when we talk about the ear hypothesis, right? That by default is sort of a less probable hypothesis because it doesn't sort of fit the uniformity of our experience, right? But whereas a rationally situated foundation with reason in the foundation seems to make just by default, I mean, we can look at other evidence, but I guess I'm not really understanding how it is that you're thinking that naturalism would sort of, naturalism that has a mindless foundation would be superior by default.
Well, it seems like you're making like a composition division fallacy and saying that that we have this property of mind, and therefore it's reasonable to conclude that mind is just fundamental to everything. So like I can make the same thing about oceans. Well, there are these things called oceans, and so they must have been made by some fundamental ocean property that just exists throughout the universe. Like it's totally possible that it's just an emergent property. That seems to be like the consensus. There's no reason to conclude it's a base level thing. It's just an assumption. I see no reason to support that conclusion.
All right, so I hear what you're saying. You're talking about another argument, which is sort of the argument from consciousness, which is not the argument I'm giving here. There's a kind of construction argument from construction that some things can't be constructed from other things, like you can't construct bees from bark or people from numbers or something, and you can just see that, right? I met a philosopher once who thought that he himself didn't exist, so he was a skeptic of our consciousness. And I asked him about that, why that was, and for him, he said that he thought that you just couldn't get sense from nonsense. Like he just thought that was impossible. And he rejected the rational foundation theory. And so then that made it so that he would infer that he didn't exist. Well, you and I agree that we exist, right? But I want to kind of separate arguments here because the argument on the table is not this argument from construction. It's just an argument from uniformity. And I'm just trying to see sort of before we look into I
don't think I'm following your argument here because I don't see any uniformity you're talking about. I see no problem just saying the nature is all there is. Minds and rationality are just descriptive properties that we've come up with. And consciousness is just an emergent property of physical interactions. I don't understand in any way how you're getting to there is like this mind or rationality thing that's just intrinsic to the universe.
Right. So nature is all there is. And the rational foundation theory is the theory that rationally situated things are all.
And I see that as equivalent to saying English foundation theory, that the English language is just foundational to reality, and that's just all there is. Because that's essentially what I see your argument to be. And I don't see any reason.
We have clear examples of things that aren't the English language, like this microphone isn't. But we don't have any example, anything that's not rationally situated. Just like if you're in the naturalist frame, let's say. I mean, I'm not sure what natural things are. I don't know what natural means. But if anything is natural, I'm happy to say everything is natural. I'm happy with that.
Well, right? So what I hear you saying is like, well, we don't see anything that we can't use English words to describe. So rationality for me is just a language description of things. So if the fact that we don't find anything that we can't describe with language isn't very surprising, it doesn't mean that language is intrinsic to those things. It just means that we can describe things with language.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that, right? What I'm saying is that we have lots of examples of things that are rationally situated. So we have inventions, we have things in our own thoughts, we have all sorts of things that are rationally situated. And it seems like unless we have an example of something that's not rationally situated, then already, I mean, this isn't like a powerful argument. This is just kind of looking at the sort of track record that might lead one to, a bit of evidence. If we're talking about, is there any bit of evidence for one view over the other? I'm not even saying it's sufficient evidence. We have to look at all the data, right? I'm just saying, if there's evidence for thinking everything's natural by uniformity, I mean, can you give an example of something that's not rationally situated? Do you have evidence for that?
Well, to me, that sounds like can you give me an example of something that can't be described with the English language? So there's a distinction made by Barry Stroud in one of his papers between doxastic necessity and modal alethic necessity. Doxastic necessity is something that's necessarily for us to believe this is the case. So it's necessary for us to interpret things with rationality because that's how our brains work. But then that doesn't follow that it entails modal alethic necessity, that it's a fundamental part of reality. There's no connection between these two things. So you just seem to be saying that, well, these things seem rationally because that's how we describe them with our minds. That's how we perceive them like a language. But it does not in any way follow that this is some modal alethic part of reality. So these are two separate categories of things. To me, it just seems like you're making the argument, well, we describe things with our language, therefore our language must be fundamental.
So maybe it'd help if I put this in other terms. Another way of putting it is that there are things that are products of a mind, okay? And on the rational foundation theory, we can have a uniformity. Everything is either built into a mind or built into the product of a mind. So this is slight evidence for this view. I mean, we can look at how we could sort of shave off unnecessary complexity. So maybe we want the theory of the foundation to be the sort of simplest among the competing hypotheses. So we say that it sort of has a supreme nature because that's a simpler way to be than to have arbitrary unexplained limits, for example. And you can have that if you're a naturalist. You call this supreme naturalism, right?
Still, one thing you said there I wanted to talk about. You said arbitrary limits. It was simpler to have a supreme being than arbitrary limits. Now that seems to be a complete inversion of simplicity to me, because simplicity is the thing with the most limits, not the thing with the least limits.
So you would say a flying spaghetti monster has lots of limits, right?
Yes, sort of.
Right, like it's got a limited number of vertices and limited number of...
It depends on how you define the flying spaghetti monster. It's pretty much arbitrary. You can define it however you want. So
sure, it's arbitrary. That's the point, right? And so I think we could agree on this, right? Like that having arbitrary add-ons, including limits and boundaries that are unnecessary, these add extra complexity to our theory beyond necessity. And,
well, I would say the opposite. I'd say if you remove limitations and you make it just infinitely open to do anything, that adds infinitely more complexity than just having a limit.
So maybe it would help to clarify what you mean by complexity here. One way that I think about it that I find helpful is to distinguish between the complexity of the reality and the complexity of the hypothesis. So the hypothesis that there are, let's go back to Cameron's ear, that there's at the foundation of reality particles arranged in the particular arrangement of Cameron's ear, that has a kind of a lot of information built into the hypothesis. And so that's what makes it more complicated. And so there are more ways that it could be false because it's got more parts. And that's what makes it have a less probability prior to our evidence. Would you agree with that? Would that make sense on your term?
I'm not sure. Let me ask a clarifying question. Yeah. So the multiverse is considered to be very not simple, right? You would agree it's not a very simple hypothesis? So
I wouldn't agree. I would not agree with that because the hypothesis that all universes exist or all conceivable universes exist is simple. By the notion of how much information is built into the theory. This is one of the things, and I think we might agree on this, this is one of the things that sort of gets lost in these debates over the fine-tuning, because people say, oh, there's no evidence of the multiverse. But it's like, but no, the multiverse is a nice, simple hypothesis. The evidence for the multiverse is the fine-tuning, right? We probably agree on this.
Possibly, but in physics, the multiverse is not really considered a very simple theory. So your definition of simplicity seems to be very different than the physics definition of simplicity.
Okay, I can explain that. It's because in order to get the right kind of multiverse that actually does predict fine-tuning, we have to add a lot of more ad hoc features. I mean, the hypothesis that all conceivable realities exist ends up being contradictory because There's a conceivable reality in which nothing exists and a conceivable reality in which something exists, but it can't be that both realities exist, right? So in order to actually get a hypothesis that in fact explains fine-tuning, you do have to add ad hoc complexity. That's right.
Okay, so would it be simpler to have a multiverse or a being that is powerful enough to create a multiverse?
Well, I think it would be simpler to have a foundation whose value is the simplest conceivable, namely supreme, or none.
Well, this is just help me understand this. So would it be simpler to have a multiverse or a being powerful enough to be able to create a multiverse? Which one of those two options is simpler?
Okay, so let me distinguish between the thing and a hypothesis. So the first hypothesis is that there is a multiverse, and the second hypothesis is that there's something that can produce a multiverse. Well, I think the second hypothesis is more complicated because I use the term multiverse in the second hypothesis.
Right. So if there's a being that's all powerful and it can create infinitely many multiverses, that is necessarily more complicated than just saying there are infinitely many multiverses, right?
If you build in the word multiverse. Now, you could instead just say there's a supreme being.
How would that be different than saying there is a being that could create the multiverse?
Well, because we have to distinguish between the simplicity of the hypothesis from the simplicity of the things the hypothesis entails. For example, take the hypothesis of common descent. One of the things that this entails is that our DNA is going to be similar. Okay, it's not a cost of the theory that our DNA is similar, right? It's a consequence of the theory, not a cost of it. The theory is kind of simple and has great explanatory power, predictive success, which is the evidence for it, right? So in the same way, I say the simplest way the foundation could be is supreme. That's the simplest theory. It would be more complicated to add arbitrary ad hoc limits to the theory. If you're worried about limits, I mean, whatever the details are, I mean, why add extra information into the theory? And then what we do is we tease out some interesting consequences, and these are predictions that allow us to actually test the theory. So it predicts that there's going to be supreme power, intentional powers to aim toward a fine-tuned universe and things like this. It seems to be that this is evidence then for the theory, and it's the simplest of the theories.
So for me, it just seems like you're arbitrarily defining all those infinitely complicated properties as just simple. So like I can just say, it's simpler to say there is a multiverse than there is a supreme being, because a supreme being could create the multiverse just by definition, since that is necessarily entailed in its properties of omnipotence or whatever great making property you want to add in there. So it seems to me that this supreme being that you are positing is the least complicated of all possible things. Like there can't be anything more complicated than that.
So okay, again, distinguishing between the theory and the things implied by the theory, right? Check in your own mind the pieces that are required to even comprehend the theory, right? Like how many concepts do you have, right? I mean, in a way, this is a little bit personalist in the sense that all evidence comes through our own senses, and so all evidence is personal. So this is why there can be reasonable, rational disagreement, and this is why we can work together and sort of clarify what the evidence is. But check in your own mind and see how complicated is it to describe the foundation as being supreme. I mean, we can use different words for this. Let's say supreme in value, or if you don't like value, let's say supreme in power, because from supreme power, we can deduce the power to know things, which gives it then the deduction, which allows us to deduce its capacity to intend things and things like this. But again, these are consequences of the theory. These aren't built in to the theory itself. I mean, I'm actually just very curious because I feel like you might be able to agree with me on this point, that if you check in your own mind and you compare the complexity of the flying spaghetti monster theory or the complexity of the Cameron ear theory, and you compare that with the complexity of the just value is pointed to positive and the simplest degree of positive. It's not positive to 2 to the 25 units, whatever that means. It's just the maximum. Isn't that simple in your own thinking?
I am not exactly following your argument here. So there's your maximal properties are there is an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, eternal, necessary being who is personal. Now, if I just take a few of those properties, just say necessary, eternal, all powerful, I can get pantheism. Now that's 3 of your 7 properties. That's a simpler explanation because it just has 3 of the properties of your, right? So So now if I remove another one, let's just say all powerful and just give eternal and necessary, I can get the multiverse out of these two. So that's even simpler.
And we can get even simpler. Just have one property, supreme.
But wait a minute, because now you're going to, like, the definition of supreme is arbitrary. You can define anything you want as supreme. So I'll define the multiverse as supreme, and it says it has the property of supreme, and so now we have a simpler explanation.
Okay, so when I'm using the term supreme, might help to sort of clarify what I mean. So I think that we get this concept through experience of things that have value. So like you have value, and you have a sense of your own value. Good thinking is more valuable than bad thinking. Rational thinking is more valuable than irrational thinking. And when you sort of get these examples in your mind, it helps you to get the concept in your mind. And it's not really a complex concept. It's sort of like the concept of the number one. It's like, here's one thing, and then here's another one thing. And so you get the simple concept. And once you get the concept, I mean, I agree with you that somebody could sort of arbitrarily make up stuff, but that's not what I'm doing here. I'm inviting you to use your own concept and just ask yourself how simple this concept of value is in your own mind. I mean,
I'm not exactly following, because I don't see a simplicity metric here on value. I don't make a connection there in my mind. I don't see the connection you're trying to get me to make. So for me, it's like this property of value, or this value scale that you're presenting. It's kind of like karma. The Hindus present that there is this scale of karma. And to me, it's like, this makes no sense to me. This just seems to be an arbitrary assertion. I don't know how this corresponds to reality. It seems just like there could be infinitely many alternative ways to define this. Why should I accept that this actually corresponds to reality and isn't just an imaginary property? And why wouldn't I accept one of the alternate definitions of what this simplicity or this scale might be? Because it seems like they're all just equally plausible here. Like there are many alternative definitions of simplicity, like the ones presented to counter the ontological argument that the greatest possible being is one that can do the most with the most limitations. And so the greatest possible being is one that can create the universe without existing, therefore God does not exist. That's one of the counter arguments. So why should I accept your definition of this simplicity being with the greatest or the least limitations, as opposed to the greatest limitations? It seems just to be arbitrary. I don't see any connection here to reality.
Yeah, so I'm just inviting you to check from your own perspective how simple the concept is. And I'm thinking of simplicity in terms of the number of parts. Like, so for example, if I had come up with this theory that the universe was created by, and I'm going to give you 3 parts, a dog working with a squirrel, working with a flying spaghetti monster. It seems like that's going to be more complicated than the theory that it was created by a dog. Okay, now the dog hypothesis is going to be actually better than the dog plus squirrel plus flying spaghetti monster because it's simpler, although it's also very unlikely because the dog also includes lots of arbitrary complexity. And I'm just inviting you to consider that from your own perspective and just see if that seems right to you, given your own concepts.
Right. If we can determine that there is a singular property from which everything can follow from, that would be simpler than having 2 properties. Yeah. But it seems to me that the God hypothesis has like 7 properties, which are all infinites and entail infinitely many properties themselves. And then you're just calling that simple. I don't see how that is simple in any way at all. Like the God hypothesis seems to be the least simple thing imaginable.
So let me try this. So this is how I sort of think about why it seems to me that power, knowledge, and goodness would be consequences of this least arbitrary, simplest account of fundamental reality, namely supreme foundation, is because when I think about properties that are value making, it seems like I can just sense by this sort of axiological sense some distinctions. If I'm praising my wife and I say, you're so beautiful, you're so awesome, you're so intelligent, you're so virtuous, you're so weak, I have this feeling like that last thing that I said, weak, sort of didn't match up with the other things. The other things had something in common that the last thing didn't have. And the thing that they had in common is this more basic property of value. And so this is why when I start with this root property of value, it seems that I can then tease out, it actually makes predictions. It predicts supreme knowledge, power, goodness that's consistent with supreme value. And so this would be much simpler than the sort of naturalistic pantheism or any other view that has more than one sort of root property.
So it seems to me,
naturalists, we can still have a natural foundation. It's just a supreme.
So if it seems to me like we have reason to believe that electrons have mass and particle and spin, but you just added this new property, this value-making property. Like this seems to be a totally arbitrary property in imagination and that has no correspondence to reality. Now, if reality did actually instantiate this value-making spectrum in some way, then we could expect that there's going to be like a value extreme somewhere in reality. But it seems to me just to be made-up property. Like I don't see any reason to believe this actually corresponds to reality any more than any of the just alternate definitions of great-making properties. Like let's just say spaghetti is a great-making property because I like spaghetti. Because I don't actually intuitively agree with any of your definitions of value making. Like I don't see value in that kind of a way or greatness in that kind of a way. It just seem to be things like a bachelor or a married man. They're just arbitrary definitions we apply to things based on our feelings. So I don't
think anything has. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, just to clarify, do you think anything has value?
Value in the subjective sense that we apply value, yes.
Okay.
Value is like an objective part of fundamental nature of reality. No, I don't think there's like a mass of value of something.
Do you think you have value even if you're not feeling the value that you have?
What? Maybe? If subjectively, yes.
Okay, so I don't want to use the word objective or subjective only because I might end up agreeing with you that value is subjective in your term. So that's why I'm asking you just to kind of clarify, because if you think that you have value, I think you have value. I don't know. And I don't think you have to be aware of your value to actually have value. And so whether that's subjective or objective doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's some value in the world.
So I would let me ask a clarifying question there. So I think value does exist as a part of a cultural kind of we have value, we apply value to things. I do not think value exists like mass and energy exist. I think those are two different kinds of existing things.
Do you think if nobody applies value, nobody recognizes someone's value, that person then thereby has no value?
I think that if no one applies value to something, then it does not have value because reality doesn't apply value to things.
Okay.
It's only us that applies value to things.
Okay. So then, yeah, I disagree with that, but I'm a friendly person, so I want to find a path that makes the most sense to you, right? So my goal isn't to convince you that I have evidence. That would be too small of a goal. I want you to see evidence. So that's my goal.
Well, do you have a reason to believe that value isn't just an imaginary thing, that it actually exists in reality as a fundamental part of reality?
I sense it. I think senses are my evidence. And I think that I sense my own value. I think I sense the value of rational thinking and truth-seeking.
Okay, and that couldn't just be an emergent property of the mind like many things?
Look, it's possible. You know, I think of senses as like windows, and maybe there's cracks in those windows, right? So you don't have to see perfectly to see something. So I think I've got lots of different senses. I have a sense of reason by which I see sort of principles of reason and then sort of that they're permanent. I have a sense of value, a sense of thoughts and feelings, introspection, sense of the passage of time. This idea that we only have like 5 senses, I think, is just sort of a myth. We have more than 5. But anyway, our senses are evidence. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that I see value by sensing it. Yes, it could be an illusion. That's possible. I could be hallucinating you right now. Cameron's ear could be causing everything. It's possible. It's just not probable.
So for me, it seems like you're adding this arbitrary trait of just this value to the just fundamental nature of reality, just across everything in reality, when it'd be much simpler just to say it's probably just an emergent property of the brains, like we know many things are emergent property of the brain. So that seems to me like a much simpler explanation with less arbitrary ad hoc additions.
Okay, so now we're getting to what explains value. The way that I was thinking of it is that we agree that there is a kind of fundamental layer of reality, like whatever it is, sort of a foundational substance. And even if it sort of regresses infinitely, there's still maybe it's energy, maybe it's something that sort of underlies that infinite regress. So we're sort of on board. And then I'm looking at what's sort of the best account of that, right? And I'm sort of with you in saying maybe we could describe it as a natural thing. It's natural in the way that you and I are natural. And then I'm just wanting to shave off arbitrary add-ons, like limits and complexities that seem to just make the theory of the foundation to be less probable, right? And so this is why I was exploring value with you, because it seems like one of the things that we observe in the world is that there is value, or at least the sense of value, or at least the feeling of value. Even if you don't agree that it's instantiated in you, there's still the feeling of value. And so one of the things that's very interesting is sort of the predictive success of a supreme foundation is that it predicts that there would be value because it's supreme. It predicts that it would have the probabilistic resources to aim to produce beings like us, right? Because it would have the supreme making qualities, including the quality of the power to produce beings like us. Whereas if you instead subtract its value to some arbitrary limit, then it seems to me you've increased the complexity at the foundation and you've removed all this predictive success. Because, right, I mean, yes, you can say, you can sort of add this thing that, you know, maybe we could just emerge sort of randomly, just like we could add a law to Cameron's ear to explain why the pixels are behaving the way they are, right? But that's just to decrease the very probability of the theory of the ultimate reality. So I'm looking for the simplest theory of ultimate reality that has the most predictive success. And I'm thinking you could be on board with this.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think that the simplest theory just isn't to mind. I think that when we talk about value, it's far simpler just to apply value as to a human construct as a product of evolution or something than it is to suppose this is a fundamental property of the nature of reality. Like when we compare these two, saying it's a product of a mind and value is attributed by humans is far simpler and entails a far more parsimonious explanation than to say it is just fundamental to reality. Like I could say anything is fundamental to reality. Like I have hunger. Let's just assume hunger is some kind of law of nature that is imbued in the universe. Like, is that simpler than just saying it's a biological process? I would disagree. So it seems to me that the simplest explanation is just like naturalistic pantheism, just an eternal, all-powerful, necessary nature. And then everything that we see around us just follows from those laws of nature and is a result of those laws of nature. Instead of just positing everything we see as its own independent law, it just follows from some simple combination of natural laws.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so it seems to me that the view that I'm articulating is not in competition with the view you're articulating. It's just that it provides a way of simplifying the view by removing sort of arbitrary add-ons. We could talk in terms of value, but maybe it would help to talk in terms of power. So would you think then the foundation of things has some sort of causal powers to produce effects?
Well, essentially, yes. So I'm granting that there is some all-powerful, some necessary, and some eternal property. Like those are essentially the three necessary properties to explain reality. Consciousness seems to be, or personhood, or sense, whichever way you'd like to call it, seems to be an ad hoc addition. We don't need that. We can get rid of that and make it simpler and just go with pantheism.
Okay, so here's how we can get that without adding anything ad hoc. We just simplify our theory of how much power the foundation has. How much power does it have? Does it have some arbitrarily limited degree of power? Or does it have the highest that's consistent with reason? The highest that's consistent with reason seems to me to involve the simplest theory of its power, because we don't have to build in this information about how it can only produce 10 to the 85 particles and no more. That's a way more complicated theory than just supreme, right? But then if it has the simplest degree of power, then we get to predict all these other things. For example, the supreme power would include the power to know things. We have that power, but you can't have the power to know things unless you're a mind. Now, again, this is a consequence of the theory. It's not built into it. This is a consequence of the simplest theory of an ultimate reality.
Right, and those just seem like all ad hoc additions to me. I can just say we have a quantum particle. It has exactly enough energy to create exactly the universe we see and nothing else. And it's determined to do this by its own nature and properties in it. That would be simpler. Even though I've just placed infinitely, or essentially complete limitations on it, that is an infinitely simpler theory than an all-powerful being as you define it.
So, okay, so help me see what I'm missing here, because I'm not seeing how I'm adding any complexity. We both agree there's power at the foundation. Right. Okay. So what's the simplest theory about how much power it has?
Well, I would say the least power required would be the simplest. If it has it has no limitations, that would be the least simple. So again, I go with the exact opposite definition of simplicity you do. Your definition of simplicity seems completely counterintuitive to me in every way. Like if I ask someone, what's simpler, what caused that noise? Is it an all-powerful, limitless being who has no parts, or is it a mouse? I mean, the mouse is simpler. The one that has the most limitations is the simplest explanation, not the one with the least limitations.
So this is interesting, because it seems to me that the flying spaghetti monster multiplies limitations.
How so?
Because it multiplies its boundaries, its geometric structure, in order for it to be spaghetti.
Well, I can just say it's supernatural, magical, non-physical spaghetti.
Oh, okay, so you can help the hypothesis by making it closer to the supreme being hypothesis. Yes.
Right, just like you're doing with consciousness. You've picked this material thing that we have no reason to believe exists outside of material. You go with consciousness, I go with spaghetti. And then we can assert these things as not being material and having some metaphysical, spaceless, timeless property to them, and then it somehow becomes simpler. So, I mean, to me, those seem to be the exact same thing.
Follow me with this. So maybe I'm missing something. So help me out here, right? So it seems to me that what you just did with the flying spaghetti monster was you removed its limits. That's how you help the theory.
Right, I'm just trying to mimic your definition to show that it seems ad hoc. Like, just calling spaghetti simple and just making it, removing limits seems completely arbitrary and ad hoc. I don't think this is a reasonable way to approach it. But if you do that with consciousness, if you do it with consciousness, I can just do it with spaghetti, and that seems to be equally reasonable on both cases, which I see as completely unreasonable. This is so I'm trying to show with a reductio ad absurdum why this is a bad method.
So I want to make sure that we're really seeing eye to eye on this, because I feel like we can make some progress here. Imagine you have a bunch of spaghetti monsters and they have these limits, right? We agree that that's very unlikely. We agree that that's unlikely.
Sure, yeah.
And my thought is that what makes it unlikely is that it has all those limits. I thought you were saying that we could just eliminate the limits so that it mimics my theory. And I hear you saying that that's not a good move, but it sounds like it would be a good move because it would at least do this much. It would make the flying spaghetti monster theory have fewer limits, because you were saying that it's the limits that actually help the theory. And I'm saying that the limits hurt the theory. It adds unnecessary ad hoc complexity beyond necessity.
Right. Well, I'm saying we can ad hocly just redefine these things and add in whatever properties you want, like just random properties like spaghetti, and say, well, we're going to add in these limitless properties to it, like spaceless, timeless, and material, and just make it work. So you can add in infinitely many properties you want, like spaghetti or consciousness or cheese whiz, and just say, well, we're just going to remove the limits on these properties, apply these simplicity things like all powerful, all knowing, or whatever, and just call them simple. So we can just add in whatever we want to the theory, call it simple, remove the limitations, make it entailed in this simple property, and it just works for everything, just anything we want. So from my perspective, it would be far simpler just to assert a quantum particle that has exactly enough power to create exactly the universe we see exactly as it is. With as much limitations, just cram limitations in here. It only has a finite amount of power that can only create exactly the universe we experience. That would be the simplest explanation.
Here's my worry with that. I think I'm tracking. My worry is that if you build in the effect into the hypothesis of the cause, you've reduced the prior probability of the cause. So for example, one of the effects is that pixels are filling the screen. And we could build that effect into the hypothesis, the Cameron's ear hypothesis. Right, but that seems to decrease the probability of the hypothesis in the same way the particle building in the effect into the theory of the particle. It has just the power to produce our universe, our very specifically, organized universe. It seems like now you just did the same thing that we would do if we built into the Cameron ear hypothesis the effect that we're seeing.
Right, I totally agree. I totally agree with you there, but it's still going to be simpler than an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being who can create infinitely many universes. So even as complicated as that is and improbable as that is, it's still a better theory than an all-powerful being.
So here's why I disagree with that. So it seems to me that, think again about the pixels. It seems like the mind hypothesis behind the pixels you're seeing is simpler than the ear plus the ear has the power to produce these specific pixels. It's simpler, has fewer conceptual parts. In the exact same way, the sort of rational foundation hypothesis is simpler.
Right, I would totally disagree, because there's nothing that can be simple about an all-powerful being who can create infinitely many multiverses. It's purely just
part of the theory. I didn't build into the theory that it was all-powerful or that it could create all these universes. That was a successful prediction.
Can it create? Is it powerful enough to create infinitely many multiverses? The God that you believe in.
Well, I think that if the foundation is supreme, then it seems by reason to follow that it would have supreme power. Doesn't that seem true to you?
Yeah, by the definition, yeah. So it seems that is in no way simple. Like that just seems like you've arbitrarily slapped the simplicity label on here for no reason.
So Tom, help me see the difference then between the mind hypothesis that explains these pixels we're seeing. What's the difference? Because you think the mind hypothesis is the better hypothesis than the Cameron ear hypothesis of the pixels. So what's the difference between the relationship between the mind and Cameron's ear hypothesis with respect to the pixels and the simple supreme foundation hypothesis, and compared to these sort of ad hoc hypothesis that the foundation has this particular law that happens to produce us in the world?
Well, for the Cameron's ear hypothesis, well, it doesn't have an empirical basis. So for me, there's the 3 tiers of knowledge here. So if it has an empirical basis, it's supported as an empirically existing thing. So the pixels and people have an empirical basis. Cameron's magical ear law does not. So that's a different class of question from my epistemology. If we're talking about metaphysics and the fundamental nature of reality, we have no basis of anything. It's all pretty much just stuff we're imagining to be the case. So it's purely based on, well, what has the least parts here? Well, what is the least entailments, least ontological entailments? That is what's the simplest explanation of everything. And the simplest explanation, what?
I was just gonna say I probably should have cleaned my ears better before this discussion. I just wanted to make one clarification, or just bring it back up in the light here. Is the distinction that you made, Josh, a little while ago about the simplicity of the theory versus the simplicity of the consequences of the theory. I don't know if that would help, like move the discussion along.
The hypothesis and the theory, is that what he said?
Yeah. So like the simplicity of the hypothesis versus the simplicity of the consequences of the hypothesis.
Yes.
So I don't really see a difference between those two things, because if like the hypothesis is just the verbal expression of the theory, it has nothing to do with the ontological properties of the theory. And so if the hypothesis, the expression of it is simple, really tells us nothing about how complicated the thing itself is, or ontologically how complicated the thing is. So the fact that we can express it in a word and say it's perfectly simple doesn't make the thing simple at all. It's just we're just using one word to describe it. So if your theory can create infinitely many multiverses, I'm going to call it as complicated as everything it can potentially create.
So maybe to help to clarify the principle here. So in science, right, we'll look for the simplest theory that explains the data. One way that kind of illustrate this is, imagine you see a flower and it looks kind of strange, and you notice on day 1 that it's 1 inch tall, on day 2 it's 2 inches tall. You don't see it on day 3. On day 4, it's 4 inches tall. You hypothesize that it was 3 inches tall on day 3, even though you didn't see it. Why is that? Well, there's infinitely many empirically equivalent hypotheses to explain that, right? But the one that's the simplest, and when I say simplest here, I mean that when you break down the hypothesis into its basic components, so you express it in the sort of cleanest language, it has the fewest parts. And so it has the fewest ways of going wrong. And so it seems like this sort of simplest hypothesis is going to predict that it's 3 inches on day 3. And we don't have to be agnostic about that. We have good evidence of that. And so that's all I'm thinking of here is that, but we also need to realize that infinitely many hypotheses are entailed by the simple hypothesis. For example, I mean, trivially, it entails that it's true. It entails every disjunction. So, I mean, there's infinitely many hypotheses that are entailed by every hypothesis, which is why you can't read the complexity of what's entailed into the complexity of the hypothesis. Otherwise, all science would, break down. So I'm just using that exact principle. That's it.
Well, I would reject that. So the fact, because again, the statements, the things that we can say about it, there are infinitely many things that we can say about it that are going to be true, using logic or whatever. But that's just language. That has no ontological statement about the theory itself. So my concern is, what are the ontological properties of the statement or the hypothesis, not the conceptual ways that we can phrase things about it. So a God that can create infinitely many beings, like if we're talking about the flower that grew 3 inches. If based on your definition, the simplest explanation would be an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, perfectly simple being to explain that, which makes no sense. Like I would just say, no, I'm going to go with biology. Biology is the simplest explanation for that, not an all-powerful being, even though it has lots and lots of limitations.
Yeah, so this is a helpful point, Tom, and it helps us to clarify that you can have 2 different explanations that aren't in competition at all, and that the evidence for the one is evidence for the other because they're not in competition. So like, for example, this pen, I dropped it. You saw it fall, right? Or the pixels or whatever. Now here's a hypothesis that would explain that. I dropped the pen. Here's another hypothesis, universal law of gravity. They're not in competition. In fact, this event is evidence of both at the same time. So unless there's a competition between 2 explanations of nature, any evidence we have for the one explanation is also evidence for the other.
Right, I'm just asserting these as mutually exclusive explanations. Let's say maybe one was caused by biology and maybe one was caused by a perfectly all-powerful simple being. Let's suppose these are competing explanations here. Based on your definition of simplicity, the all-powerful being would be simpler. Now I'm saying, no, that makes no sense at all. I'm going to go with the flower because the limitations placed on it, there are more limitations on it, which makes it simpler. So when you have less limitations, it's less simple. Because it makes no sense to me to claim that there is an all-powerful being who can create infinitely many universes, and that is somehow simple. That makes absolutely zero sense to me at all.
So we might possibly be talking past each other. So maybe I just need to get clear here, because I'm just not saying that those are in competition, right? So evidence for the one is evidence for the other. I mean, all I'm doing is filling out. So one of the books I really enjoyed by Brian Greene is The Elegant Universe. I don't know if you've seen this, but he talks about sort of getting into a deeper explanation of things. And so he goes through some different possibilities, and the book is just beautiful. It's an elegant book. And one of the things that really I appreciate about the book is that he's trying to give the sort of simplest, deepest explanation of things. And it's not in competition with biology. It's not like we say, oh, Brian, we already know where flowers come from. Put your string theory away, right? We don't say that. Instead, we're looking for the sort of simplest, most unified account that has the highest predictive success. And it seems to me that naturalism is pretty good. And all I want to do is just clean it up by making it even better, by just adding, well, really subtracting the ad hoc complexity of limits.
By adding infinitely powerful, infinitely knowing, infinitely perfect. Yeah, that does not seem like a subtraction at all. That seems like it's a complete ad hoc, lots and lots of ad hoc.
I'm just uniformity. I'm just following the evidence where it leads, right? So we have rationally situated things. The foundation's rational. We don't have to say that all of our beliefs come from mindless stuff. This fits the evidence, right? So I'm not seeing any evidence on the other side, but I'm seeing that the supreme foundation theory is simple, high predictive success. It solves problems we haven't talked about, various problems it solves. Solves the problem of explaining the irrelevant differences between sort of an uncaused foundation and caused things, for example. And, I mean, Cameron's ear isn't uncaused because it's not relevantly different from things that are caused, right? We can sort of see this. But what would be relevantly different? Well, it seems like a supreme foundation would solve this problem because it would explain why the foundation is uncaused. It's uncaused because it has a supreme kind of existence, and that predicts it's being uncaused. So I can't think of like a simpler hypothesis that has the same predictive success that also solves the same problems. And I mean, I don't know. I guess
let me jump in here real quick. So I interviewed Justin Mooney a little while ago. It's going to be coming up on our podcast pretty soon here. But we talked about his paper that he wrote. He basically tries to give like this abductive argument that the fine-tuning argument you can deduce or sort of abduce. You can use an abductive argument and see that like, so if the cause of the fine-tuning has some sort of like set of perfections, then you can deduce, well, like, or you can ask, why does it have this set of perfections? And here's a theory that the foundation has all perfections. Anyways, the reason why I bring this guy up, and I actually just lost my thought here, but I may just have to pass it back to you guys until I think about it again.
What's theory that has the highest predictive success?
Right. So I can pick up on that. I can say that just the naturalism hypothesis can explain everything. There's no problem explaining everything, just like you can explain everything under the theist hypothesis. So I see no added explanatory power on the theist hypothesis here.
Just dropping this pen explains its falling.
Right.
But I mean, like, there's not a competition, right? So I'm just trying to simplify naturalism.
Right. I'm saying
parts.
Right. I'm doing the same thing, and I'm simplifying it by removing all the God things that you keep adding because they're just ad hoc additions.
I'm not adding them. I'm saying, look. We agree that there's power at the foundation. We agree with that. I'm just giving the simplest theory of its nature, supreme.
Well, you keep calling it simple, but to me, adding an all-powerful being there's nothing simple about that. So you're
going to have I remembered where I was going with that, and it actually is an objection for it's a clarification for you, Tom, and sort of an objection for Josh. And so one of the objections that he discusses in this paper, that's where I was going back to, the paper that he wrote. One of the objections is that, like, and we can think of really mundane examples. Anything that okay, so this glass here is sitting on my desk here. What's the explanation of that? Well, I guess I would be the explanation. but God would be a simpler explanation according to you, Josh, right? And so the question there is like, well, why wouldn't we infer if God is a simpler explanation? Why wouldn't we infer that God is the explanation instead of me? You know, because I have all these limitations. I'm not God, and anyway. So that, I guess that's a question that I have too. Is it like, I know how Justin Mooney responds in that paper to this objection, but I think, Tom, does that help? Like, I think you made that point earlier about the mouse.
Well, yeah, then he said they're not contradictory explanations and they can both indicate a God. And whereas I'm trying to place an arbitrary limit here and saying, yes, we're going to say that they are contradictory explanations simply by going by Josh's definition, which one would be simpler if they were contradictory explanations? That's my question.
Okay, so I'll pass that back to you.
If you place the arbitrary limit, then you decrease the probability of the prior. You decrease the prior probability. So, I mean, because my first thought is that there's layers of explanation, right? Just like string theory could provide a deeper layer of explanation. It doesn't compete.
Right, I'm totally with you. You can definitely say that God created the natural laws. The natural laws explain all these things. Let's just suppose that they're contradictory explanations. Which one would be simpler?
So just spell out. So what are the two contradictory explanations?
Like the biology causing the flower to grow versus a God, or the cup being there caused by Cameron versus a God, or just a natural explanation with very many limitations versus a God with no limitations.
And he doesn't explain things through any kind of rational process. Because this is what I think of nature. That's what nature is. It's a rational process. I'm trying to see how they're in competition. So, because it seems like if you say naturalism and no God, you've increased the complexity of the theory. You've added something. Right? So that's how. Am I not? Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to establish how exactly you're defining an all-powerful being is simple here. So if I say there is some event X, event X is caused by some finite thing Y, or event X is caused by some unfinite, unlimited thing God, which of these is a simpler explanation?
Well, if you put it in that abstract form, I would say that the hypothesis that the cause is supreme, that strikes me as simpler than the hypothesis that the cause has some arbitrary set of limits, like the flying spaghetti monster.
Right. So if we applied this to Cameron's cup example, we say, why is Cameron's cup there? This is event X. It could be caused by some finite thing, Cameron, or it could be caused by some unlimited thing, God. You're saying that if these were in competition, which we're just going to assert they are purely abstractly, if they were in competition, the God hypothesis is simpler than the Cameron hypothesis based on your definition.
The prior probability. I mean, we might have other evidence, right? I mean, we're talking about prior probability. So obviously, other evidence could sort of turn things. But I mean, the point is we don't have any evidence of anything that's not rationally situated or anything that, right, would be sort of in competition with the supreme being foundation. So the supreme foundation hypothesis. So that, I feel like we might be pretty close.
Right. So my position is that's completely backwards. I would never, ever grant that as the simpler explanation. I would always say the finite thing X causing the finite thing Y is always a simpler explanation than an unlimited, all-powerful being. That can never even cohere in my head as a simple explanation.
Well, now let's just make sure we're not getting confused on words, because you say unlimited, all-powerful. So now you're adding complexity to the hypothesis by adding words.
Well, I see those as all ontologically the exact same thing. If the way you define simplicity, if it entails having all-powerful as one of its perfections, then is going to be all-powerful by my definition. So whatever it entails, those are each going to be properties that add complexity by my understanding. So the fact that you just simply call it simple doesn't actually make it simple.
So maybe this would be a good point then to come back to the difference between the theory and the consequences, because I think this is critically important. So tell me what's wrong with this thinking, right? So for every hypothesis H entails something else, namely that H is true or there are pink bunnies. Okay. Now this thing that H entails, call this H2, is more complex than H. Does it make H more complex? Does it reduce the prior probability of H?
I would go with no.
Good.
Probably not.
Good. So the consequences of the theory don't reduce the probability of the theory.
Right.
That's all I'm doing. I'm just teasing out the consequences of.
I totally understand. My contention is that you can take anything you want, make it a consequence, and then take it away from the complexity of the theory. So let's say the spaghetti monster. The spaghetti monster has this intrinsic property of simplicity, and spaghetti isn't actually a property of the spaghetti monster. Spaghetti is simply a consequence of the simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
So you can just add anything you want as a consequence, infinitely many things, no matter what they are, no matter how complicated they are, and just say, well, all these are a consequence, therefore it's still perfectly simple.
Well, it has to actually be a consequence. I mean, you can't just like make it up, right? You have. I mean, that's the beauty of the Supreme Being Foundation. It's like it actually has these interesting consequences that you can see through the light of reason, through checking. You can test it. Right? I'm not just making it up, and I'm not just saying, let's add all these properties and pretend they come from a Supreme Foundation. I'm saying we can see that, right?
Well, that's exactly the argument I'm making, is that you do seem to be just adding these in ad hoc. You have a theory that you already believe in, and then you're going to define it as simple, and then say that all the theories or all the properties that you want that instantiate your belief are just consequences of this perfect simplicity. Now, I can just do the same thing for the spaghetti monster.
Can we tease that out real quick? Can we tease that out? Like, so Tom, what do you think is entailed by a supreme hypothesis? Or like, what do you think is or is not?
Well, I would go with all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, personal, eternal, conscious, necessary. Probably some of those. I don't know exactly what Josh would define, but one of those 7 would probably be the ones I'd go with.
That would be entailed by it, right?
Or consequences, as Josh defines them, of the simplicity.
Yeah, entailed or consequences. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's all I had. So it does seem like you guys agree about that. It's not like he's making up these properties and adding them to the theory. It's like these are actual consequences.
Oh, no. I'm saying these are just what he would add to them, and I reject that. I think they are just made up. I think you can remove all of them, essentially.
Okay, so like from the Supreme Being hypothesis, you don't think anything is entailed by it?
Right. I think there is some necessary thing to the universe, and we can call that supreme in some sense. But I think we can say nothing else about it. So
yeah, well, I'm talking about like Josh's theory. Like take Josh's theory, the Supreme Being hypothesis. Like however he defines it, and then you don't think anything follows from that. Like there's no entailments.
Right. I just think it's a made-up definition. I think that it's no more reasonable than the spaghetti monster definition of the supreme spaghetti monster or the pantheist.
Yeah, suppose it's made up. Like you still don't think anything it follows from this made-up definition.
What do you mean by follows? I'm not following you.
Like entailed, there's no consequences. Like there's no other properties that this thing has. Like you can think of, okay, so think of like Harry Potter. Okay, he's a made up figure. So like he has no entailments. Like he has no relationships or other properties. He doesn't have the property wearing glasses.
No, I would grant that he has those properties.
Okay, so like that made up theory can still have like certain entailments or certain other properties that are like entailed. So my question is, so like from this theory that Josh has, are there any other properties that are entailed by that theory? Call it made up, call it whatever you want, but do you see any consequences from that theory?
Other than those 7 properties?
Yeah, so you do think that those 7 properties follow.
Right. I'm saying I grant that he has this property he calls simplicity, and based on his definition, these 7 properties follow from his definition of simplicity. This is my representation of his theory.
Okay.
My contention is that you can just define this property of simplicity, put in any other properties you want other than these 7 that he's chosen, like spaghetti, and then call this thing perfectly simple. So you can say this definition he is constructed of perfectly simple has these 7 properties, which are just arbitrarily chosen because they're the things he believes in, and you can just pick any other set of properties and call them perfectly simple.
Okay, so what definition of simplicity are you working with? Like what is your ultimate definition of simplicity?
Well, in context of the way he's using it, it's essentially just arbitrary. You can make any definition you want. We don't know what the simplicity is in this sense. Like I would just go with the thing that is the most limited, that can just explain everything, is probably the simplest. So like the quantum particle that can just has exactly enough power to create exactly the universe we see with exactly the properties it has. That would be the most simple explanation.
Why would it be the most simple?
Because it has the most limitations. It has the least excess parts.
But why is that the most simple?
Because it seems to cohere with more like the scientific definition of simplicity. What caused that noise? Whatever the most limited thing that can cause that noise is the simplest explanation. So if it was a mouse, that's the simplest explanation. as opposed to an all-powerful being with no limitations.
Okay. So it seems like it does sort of go back to this competing ideas of what simplicity is. Would you agree, Josh, or would you like want to make any more clarifications there?
I think that progress here would follow the lines of clarifying different notions of simplicity. I just want to say that my reasons for thinking that a supreme foundation would have supreme power, supreme intentional abilities, and things like this has nothing to do with any kind of prior beliefs. It goes the other way. It's just as I'm trying to figure out reality, I'm thinking about the simplest theory, and I can just tell you that this is one of my reasons for thinking the foundation has these properties. It's because it seems like this theory has a lot of predictive success. It doesn't add any sort of arbitrary add-ons. It predicts things. Like it predicts, for example, not just that there would be value, but it also predicts that there would be a greater probability that there would be beings who could see value or appreciate value. It raises the probability of that. I see no way of getting that same kind of probabilistic result without another theory that builds in the effect, just like adding a law to Cameron's ear or something like this. And so I just wanted to make clear that it's not like I'm just like making up properties that I already have some antecedent belief in and then just teasing them out. I mean, this is honestly like how it seems to me. So, I mean, I just am trying to follow the evidence. And this is where I think it's important for, these kind of conversations to take place. This is why I appreciate the conversation with you, because I'm constantly learning. I mean, there's always things I'm missing. And I feel like, I don't know, I guess I feel like a lot of times these conversations can sometimes get almost competitive and polarized, and people are almost like, I don't know, not seeing as much from each other as they could. And so it's one thing that I really appreciate about you kind of pressing, so what do I mean by simplicity? I mean, I need to really get that clear, and I think I can make that clear. I mean, I have some things I've written that spell it out in more detail, and we could talk about that.
Well, let me ask you in a little different way. So there's this property of simplicity, and there are these 7 properties of a God that follow as consequences of this definition of simplicity. Now, why can't I just assert different properties? Why these 7? Why are these 7 follow from this simple thing, and I can't just put in spaghetti?
So let me just clarify. It's not that it follows from simplicity. It's that it follows from supremacy. And that my claim is that supremacy is not a massively complex property like the flying spaghetti monster. And then the way that I tease out these properties is by thinking about value. So I think of supremacy as sort of the highest degree of value. And then I just think about, I have this sort of praise test. If I'm praising my wife, which properties would be sort of conducive to value? Would she feel appreciated if I say, you're so valuable, you're so weak? It's like, that weak doesn't come from value, right? It seems like power does. Does that make sense to you? Or does that seem right?
Right, but I don't think that value is a property of things existing in the world. So it's like saying that it has the property of being a bachelor. It's like, well, that's just a made-up thing that we've imposed on the world. How exactly do you attribute this to an existing fundamental supreme thing?
Yeah, so I mean, my thought is that beings have value, right? But at least, even if beings don't have value, at least I can come up with a hypothesis that would simplify our theory of the foundation. If value is not a good starting point, let's use power. We agree the foundation has power. And then we can think about what's the simplest account of its power. A limited degree that gives it exactly the power to produce our universe. Then you're building in the effect into the hypothesis, which maximizes its complexity. Just like building into Cameron's ear, the effect that it produces these pixels, it maximizes its complexity. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
Well, question about that. So our universe is always going to be built in because it is the thing we are explaining. So our universe is going to be built into the explanation of a supreme being, just like it is built into the quantum particle. The thing is, there's all this other stuff that's also built in addition to our universe.
Okay, so right, we have to distinguish prior probability from the predictive success of the hypothesis. So what's built into our experience now are these pixels, right? But that doesn't help the Cameron ear explanation of the pixels, okay? Because that just adds complexity to the Cameron ear explanation, whereas the mind explanation of these pixels is simpler. So it's just the same thing. I'm just saying that
I don't see the connection of how this applies to the fundamental nature of the universe.
yes, I'm coming with a hypothesis that can explain many of the things that we see. It has predictive success. I mean, we can maybe debate some of the things that exist in our world. So, like, I think that there's a kind of principles of reason exist, and at least there are reasoning beings that can sort of apprehend principles of reason. At least we agree on that. If the foundation is supreme, that's a hypothesis, kind of like a mind hypothesis behind these pixels, then I haven't added lots of extra complexity to the hypothesis, but I get a lot of predictive power that matches with actual reality, like the permanence of principles of reason, and not so unlikely probability that there would be reasoning beings, value, or at least a sense of value, and there's many other things. Whereas if instead you say, no, the foundation has a law that has just as much power as is required to produce all these things, then you've built the effect into the probability. And so you've ruined its prior probability in the same way as building in the pixels into the ear hypothesis. You ruin the you multiply its prior probability, or you ruin it. You ruin the hypothesis. You make it worse.
Well, we can ambiguate it and say there's a law that makes a possible range of universes, and ours is just one of the possible range. So that doesn't seem to be.
Yes,
it just
that does help.
So let me ask you this way.
See, this is progress. See, that does help. It simplifies the theory. Not as simple as supreme beings. It doesn't have as much predictive success, but it is better. It improves it.
I would say that makes it less simple. It just adds more parts to it. So let's ask a question about, like, let's suppose we're living 3,000 years ago and we're trying to explain lightning. Mm-hmm. Now, I could come up with a theory that there is trillions and trillions of positively and negatively charged particles rubbing together, creating an electrical charge. Now, this is a terribly not simple explanation. Somebody else can come along and say, well, there's this guy in the sky named Zeus, and he just creates it and throws it down. That seems like a much simpler explanation based on your definition. Like, so for me, simplicity really doesn't seem to make a difference here.
Well, so I mean, I agree with you that that may not be the best explanation, but we also have to be careful to tease out why it's not the best explanation. Because it might be that we just agree that it's false because we have better explanations. And we don't want to say that a theory is not the best explanation just because it's not correct.
Sure.
I mean, because there can be simple theories that are the best explanation, right?
Right.
Yes.
So again, from my perspective, when we're trying to explain the universe, it's just like another one of those, like an argument from ignorance. We see lightning, we can't explain lightning, let's say God. We see lightning, why not just say it's just another undiscovered natural thing, like all the things we've ever discovered throughout all of history? Why are we imposing a mind here?
Right. So my thought is the same thing. Why impose a mind behind the pixels, right? It's not based on what we don't see. It's based on what we do see. It's the simplest explanation of what we see. We're not positing arbitrary, unexplained limits or non-rational causes. We have no examples of that. Right? We're not breaking the uniformity of rationally situated things. It's the simplest explanation that has the highest predictive power.
And how is that?
A mathematical landscape. It predicts a moral landscape. These are successful predictions of the theory. And then we witness these actual realities. And so that's how it seems to me. It just seems like it's the best explanation.
Well, so I'm still trying to understand, how is that different from saying lightning was caused by Zeus? Because we can explain all that from natural causes too. It's just a product of evolution in the minds, and that seems to be a far more parsimonious explanation.
Well, Zeus has all sorts of arbitrary limits.
Okay, well, let's say he's just like the Christian God. The Christian God, we're going to call him Zeus, and he caused the lightning.
Okay, well, so if you remove the arbitrary limits, then you've increased the prior probability of the theory, right? Now, again, we have to. There's not a competition. There's layers of explanation, like Brian Greene's theory of, the string theory. There's layers of explanation. So we have to really get that clear that we're not in competition here. If we go for the simplest, least arbitrary theory that explains the most, that doesn't compete with the explanation that, we see these pixels because of minds. There's no competition there. I feel like you understand what I'm saying. I feel like you get it.
I'm not sure. So I still, because it seems to me everything you're doing is just exactly the same as the guy 3,000 years ago is saying, lightning created by Zeus. I see absolutely no difference here. You're just saying, well, we can, you see, when we have a hammer and we smash things, it creates these sparks, and those sparks are kind of similar to these sparks, therefore mind. So for me, it seems like the simplest explanation, like everything we've ever discovered in all of nature, is just another natural thing we haven't discovered yet. It seems like minds are just an emergent property of nature. I see no reason to believe that these value things are fundamental to reality, and they're just emergent properties of minds. So it seems the simplest explanation is that it's just another natural thing, and we can just say there's a natural, necessary thing that exists that doesn't have a mind. And why is this debate we're having any different from the debate about lightning?
Oh, Josh,
I didn't know. Yes, go ahead.
I think you want to jump in here, but I think we've gone around this like enough. We've talked about simplicity, and we could probably end up talking about that for another like 5 hours. But
I actually wanted to raise a different point just because we have a few minutes left. That has nothing to do with simplicity.
Okay, I have a couple questions. Okay. If we can get to them, we can. But if not, then that's fine.
So I was just curious, Tom, if you're familiar with Stuart Kaufman's work on complex adaptive systems and building complexity.
Vaguely, not a lot.
So the reason why I'm familiar with it is just because I was part of a research group that was testing a hypothesis about sort of what natural selection does in a system of self-replicating structures. And I had no idea like what to expect. One hypothesis was that natural selection would tend to promote increases in complexity if the selection function is randomized. Another hypothesis was that it would tend to do nothing. And the third was that it would tend to reduce complexity.
You broke up.
Okay.
Hey, Josh, yeah, you were explaining the 3 different hypotheses.
Yes. So one hypothesis is that natural selection in a complex adaptive system that is a population of self-replicators will tend to cause the replicators to reduce in complexity over time. That's how they adapt to the environment. The other is that they tend to increase in complexity, and the other is that they about stay the same. I wasn't sure what to expect. One of the things that I discovered is that if I specified a target where I wanted the sort of evolution to go, then natural selection was beautiful. That's helping to solve problems to reach that target. But when I randomized the selection function, it was very interesting because in all my experiments, it always reduced the complexity of the structures. I could even make arbitrarily complex things, and then I would come back after many generations and it would go away. And this is a testable thing that other people have been doing at the Santa Fe Research Institute. And to my knowledge, there's a kind of an agreement by the relevant experts on this that nobody has seen that the natural selection without some kind of fine-tuning or mind behind it, that will increase the complexity. And it seems like this would have to be evidence for the rational foundation theory. I was curious if you've heard of this, and what you would think about this kind of evidence.
Well, yeah, definitely in biology, it happens all the time. Without a selection pressure, then you just get degrading genes with genetic mutations that fall off because there isn't the selection pressure of the more increasing information, or whatever you want to call it, of the new, more survivable products. So, but I don't see how this in any way correlates to your theory of a mind or anything.
No, because the selection pressure itself reduces complexity. That's what we find. That's what we see. Unless you set up the environment in a fine-tuned way. I mean, biology and cosmology are both pointing in the same direction. So you got to get those dials set up just right. Whereas if you have that sort of supreme foundation theory, then that predicts supreme mind, which then gives us the probabilistic resources to direct things in this way to set up the system. Otherwise, it just runs in the other direction. And this is a future testable prediction. You can make your own programs. You can see the research others have done. And I had no idea what to expect myself. I mean, I just fully imagined that the complexity would increase. I'd come back the next day. I showed my wife, like, look at these bugs. They're so complicated. It just went in the opposite direction. And there was selection pressure. That's the thing. The point is that in our early Earth, the open question is whether the nature of early Earth is a rationally situated thing, like everything else we know in experience, or whether it's just founded ultimately on mindless causes. And what these programs seem to support is that if the foundation has the mental resources, it would explain why evolution seemed to move in an upward direction with respect to complexity, because that's what we observe, right, through the fossil record. There was a kind of upward direction. And so this prediction follows nicely from the from the mind hypothesis together with these computer programs?
Well, from my understanding of the abiogenesis, the best theory we have is like the RNA world, and the fact that we can observe RNA being built on clay molecules, self-organizing without any kind of mental organization process behind it. It's just natural processes that gain complexity and build things on their own. So I mean, I don't think there's any evidence that life is mind created. I think the biggest consensus in most of biology is that it's not right now.
But this is the evidence. The evidence is that these programs are showing that the natural selection doesn't increase the complexity of the structures, and that even the natural environment itself, because when you say, well, it looks like it's coming from nature, well, what is nature? Right? I mean, nature is infused with laws. It's the environment in which this can happen. And what I'm saying is that this is exactly what you'd expect from the mind first hypothesis, where you wouldn't expect this if you don't have the mind first hypothesis. At least that's how it seems to me.
Well, I think it goes back to what we were originally talking about of whether it's nature first or rationality first.
Yeah.
And it seems to be like it would, in fact, happen on the nature first hypothesis if rationality is just a description of the way nature is. So, I mean, because we get rationality both, either way. If nature's first and rationality describes nature, we still have rationality. If rationality is first and nature is described by or is a result of rationality, we still have rationality. So either way, we get rationality.
So we don't get rationality for free, right? So this is why we're thinking of hypotheses that would explain, why rationality would ever exist. Why would we ever having this cool conversation, right? I mean, we don't just get that for free. I mean, this is part of our data that we're trying to explain. So, I mean, this is one thing I just want to make sure is clear. This is not part of the theory, it's part of the data that we're trying to explain. I think you would agree with that, right?
Well, actually, I think we do get rationality for free. Rationality is just a description of the way reality is. So it's already there as a part of reality. Reality has a certain nature, and we're just using rationality to describe it. So we get English for free. English isn't a fundamental part of reality. It's just something we use to describe reality.
What I mean is that we're trying to understand like why there are beings like us in the first place, right?
Right, and I just think it's probably just natural things. Like I think the being designed by some other being is probably just an anthropomorphism, like saying lightning was caused by Zeus. I don't see any reason to believe that we're actually created by another mind of any kind.
Even if this goes against all that we know from our computer-based simulations. I mean, maybe if you looked into those computer-based simulations, it might, I don't know.
Well, I've seen a lot of the computer-based simulations, and they usually come to the same evolutionary conclusion. Richard Dawkins talked about one in his documentary of his first book, his really big one. I forgot what it was called now. But so we've done the computer simulations. Many of them do show increases in complexity, and in the case of the cell in biological tests, like in the case of E. coli, we also see increased complexity in those kinds of things. So I'm not sure specifically what you're talking about, unless you're using a different definition of complexity than I'm aware of. We do see these kinds of increases in complexity and information in cells all the time.
When the selection mechanism is not just randomized. But you are right that defining complexity is a key point here, because I've seen a number of articles on this topic, and you have to look very carefully at how they're defining complexity. Some of them end up defining complexity in a way that I want to say is sort of cheating. So, but if you sort of leave it, I use a kind of Kolmogorov hierarchical complexity, which seems to match a kind of ordinary intuitive sense of complexity, kind of functional complexity. And I mean, I could just tell you, I ran the experiments, and the results all pointed in one direction. I mean, so this is repeatable. We can continue to investigate this and get more data. And maybe this is a note of agreement here, where we both agree that we want data that can sort of test our theory, and that the best theory is going to be the one with the sort of best predictive success, and it's the least ad hoc.
Real quick, we're almost at the 2-hour mark. Are you guys okay with going a little longer, or do we need to start to wrap it up?
I'm okay with either. I'm enjoying the conversation.
This is fun. I think the only other question I have is about the problem of evil. I've heard Tom talk about some things here. It's a little bit straying from the topic of is there any evidence, but it's maybe related because it's related.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually wanted to ask you one more thing. Why not use Shannon complexity instead? Couldn't you just because there's different kinds of complexity theory?
Yes, I understand. We could probably work with different ones. The reason why I used kind of hierarchical, I mean, it was actually my own specific formulation. I was going through examples of things like paintings and things that like look my kids' drawings, and seeing, okay, this looks like it's not just random. And I was trying to come up with a definition that would account for that. In the end, I don't feel like I really even successfully came up with a definition that was as clear as this sort of, just look at the screen. Are any of the creatures that evolved on my screen anything like a self-replicating arm, or not arm, but self-repairing hand?
And you mentioned, you said that when the selection pressure was random, does that mean it was selected randomly or randomly changed?
So it was I randomized the selection function, meaning that the conditions for survival, I didn't specify, because part of the thing that makes it tricky to do this when we think about Earth is that we already have the environment sort of set up in a certain way. And so that sets up the selection function. And I tried to just randomize. I came up with some big, simple rules, and it would just randomly select them.
So wouldn't that mean that the selection functions were more like the predetermined kind that we would see a gain in information for when we were looking at the early Earth atmosphere, rather than just the randomly picked ones?
Well, if that is the case, then I would have expected increases in complexity in my system, but I didn't see that.
Well, you said we did have increases in information when they were not randomized, correct?
When I specifically, for example, I had one program where I wanted creatures to get longer. And so then I basically built in that if it's longer, it's more likely to survive. And then I just ran the program. They randomly grew longer, and the shorter ones died out. And I thought, oh, that's cool.
Well, isn't that like what we see in natural selection in the early Earth? Wouldn't that be like, if they did get longer, they would survive longer?
Well, I think, yes, if you specify the target towards complexity, then they would move in that direction. And I think that is what we see in early Earth. The target's been specified, Tom. That's the evidence we have.
You would just argue for a specifier, right?
Well, that would make sense. That would predict the phenomenon.
All right. So you had a question about the problem of suffering.
Yeah. So I was listening to some of your other conversations, and very interesting. And I was very much resonating with many of the things you were saying. And one of the things that you brought up, I just thought was interesting, and I just wanted to ask you about it. And maybe I could put it this way. Could you sort of summarize your argument against the existence of a morally perfect being? And then after that, I'm going to ask a question about that.
All right. So if there was a morally perfect being, it would have created the best of all possible worlds, which is a world where it is physically impossible for any one person or any one being to force any other to do something without their consent. We do not live in such a world. Therefore, there is no all-powerful or all-good being.
Good. Okay. So we do not live in such a world. I wanted to get clear on kind of why you're thinking that.
Because people can force other people to do stuff without their consent. That's the whole crimes thing.
Okay, so the reason, so maybe this won't connect, but this is my thought. So are you familiar with this idea that people actually do decide on the kind of life that they're going to live? So Richard Swinburne has a hypothesis like this, and some people in near-death experiences report something like this, where you actually do have some kind of choice. And so what I was thinking was that your principle of liberty, instead of being an objection to a morally perfect being, could be more like a tool to tease out an implication of the kind of world we would be in if it were morally perfect. Namely, it would be a world in which we actually have more choice than we might have thought, even choice in terms of sort of our location in life. Have you thought of that, or does that fit with your thinking of things?
I'm not exactly sure. So if I was given choice, I could have essentially my own universe and choose to do with it anything I want. That would be more choice than what I have now.
No, I'm saying maybe that's what you have, right? So I'm saying if your principle is true and the foundation is morally perfect, then what would follow from that would be that you've chosen to be in this universe with all its complexities. You've chosen this challenge.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely possible that everyone here just chose to be here and chose to go through all of this suffering. Right. That's kind of like saying that all of the slaves in the past, well, they volunteered to be slaves, but they just forgot, and the history books recorded it wrong. That's kind of like the same kind of argument.
You might find it improbable because you think the probability that God exists is improbable, right? So that would make sense. That would be a reasonable inference. But my point is that if the prior probability of a supreme foundation is not improbable, then you just tease out the implications, right? And so the implications can't be like less probable.
Right. If the Christian kind of God would have created that kind of a world and didn't do all the stuff in the Bible, then yes, that is definitely a possibility.
So, I mean, that could be all part of the choice, right? I mean, that could be part of the kind of scenario we're in. I mean, so I don't know.
If the Bible is false and that's all just purely an imaginary part of the world we've chosen to be in, yes, there's definitely a possibility.
Or even if it's true, right? I mean, what I'm just saying is that it looks like your principle doesn't establish that the morally perfect being doesn't exist. It just is a tool for deducing some of its implications, and that implication is not falsified by anything we have experienced. That was it. That was just my thought.
Yeah, it's definitely possible.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's definitely possible. I would say that it is definitely the Christian God is still falsified under this hypothesis because of all the things that it's admitted it's done without other people's consent. Like Job did not consent to being tortured.
Well, but the whole hypothesis was that there was a kind of consent to the kind of world to be in, right? I mean, unless you're saying that there's, the best world is one in which you're not even allowed to consent to be in a world in which sometimes things don't go your way, right? But I don't think that's what you're saying.
Right, but I'm pretty sure you would have to add that as an implicit assumption, and then you'd have to state certain statements in the Bible are false when they say this person did not consent. Well, they actually did consent. They just consented before to being in this world. So
well, we'd have to look at the text.
Right.
Fair enough. Fair enough. It could be falsified, and that's a good thing about the theory. So, yeah. All right, that's all I have.
Okay, so questions? Are you guys ready to?
I'm good with questions.
Sure.
Okay, I just have two. One of them is from Doug, Pine Creek. This was one of the first questions he posted. He's actually, I don't know why I can't talk tonight. He posted a bunch of different questions. He's hoping that you watch this back and like look at all of his questions and then question them in your mind. But this was one of his first ones. What would be the second best explanation or hypothesis to explain value and power other than a supreme being?
Is this for me?
Yeah, that's for you, Josh.
I don't know. Excuse me. That's a great question. I'd have to think about that. Maybe if we sort of add in a little bit of an arbitrary limit that gives us the same or nearly the same predictive success. I don't know if there's a next best.
You could just do like value -1.
Yeah. But see, I don't know that there's anything continuous. It's like 1 less than infinity is, there's no sort of neighbor to infinity. So
can value
a lot about whether there's something continuous with supreme, and I'm not sure. It's a good question.
Can value be explained without a being?
Without a being?
Like just an undiscovered law of nature kind of thing.
Yes, I think I know what you're asking. I think value is basic. It's not explained. It's entailed.
And can it be entailed in a non-being, kind of like my pantheism argument? And so that would be like this, could be a second best.
Oh, sure. There's other ways of, of course.
So would that qualify as like the second best explanation, essentially? Something like that?
Well, no, that's 50 or 60, way below, way down. We've added all these things.
All right.
All right. The other question, I have another question for Josh. And this one is from Kit Alcock. Sorry, buddy. It goes, does this foundation only have one property, supremacy, or does he think that the foundation has omnipotence, omniscience, etc., where those properties aren't identical to supremacy?
Yeah, good question. I do want to clarify. I'm not saying the foundation is itself simple. I'm talking about a simple theory of the foundation. And I tend to think of this sort of supreme value as a kind of root that entails these other attributes. So the other attributes are not identical with I'm not committed here to a kind of divine simplicity.
Okay. Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would just go back into our argument we've already had. So,
okay. I can find another one from Pine Creek here. I'll just ask one more, and then we'll close it out. I'm scrolling back up. Okay. He says, would you have, this is for you again, Josh. This is from Pine Creek again. Would you have less meaning, purpose, and hope in your life if it were true that there was no supreme being?
This question is very valuable because it gets to motivation. And one thing that I've thought about, one of the great virtues of a truth seeker who comes to a view that kind of goes against what they would want to be true is that it takes a kind of courage to come to that. And it does seem to me that if there were no supreme foundation, it would decrease the sort of value that's sort of ultimate in the world and give me less reason for optimism. So I will say that, yeah, I mean, the supreme foundation theory does give me a reason for optimism. I think it takes a kind of courage to follow evidence to beliefs that aren't optimistic. I think it also takes a kind of courage to seek truths that could be treasures even before you see what that evidence is. So both take courage. In one case, it's a courage of disappointment. In the other case, it's a courage of sort of just facing reality, even if it's not what you want to believe. That's my long answer. Probably the short answer would just be yes.
All right, so I have two questions for Tom now, and then after this, I'm going to close it out. So this one is from J.R. Amon. Is existence a good thing? Is it better to not exist?
I don't really have an opinion. Like, I like existing. I think existing is good for me, but I know that there are some people who would probably disagree. And so I think it's really not it's kind of like a value thing. It's something that we impose on reality. It's not like existence is fundamentally a better thing to have in reference to the universe. It's not like a property of the universe that makes things better. It's something that we impose on things. We like things to exist more than they don't exist.
Any thoughts on that, Josh?
I have nothing really to add. I don't really have an intuition that existence itself is valuable. I've thought about it, but I don't have a clear intuition about that. Maybe the experience of existence is.
So here's the next one for you, Tom. And this one is from Pine Creek. He's switching gears here. What would change your mind that a supreme deity exists?
Well, I would be willing to grant a really powerful being with just novel testable predictions. Like if I could pray to a god and get a gold brick every time, that's good evidence. I would be satisfied with that. But I'm not, the properties of like all powerful. I'm not sure anything could convince me that there is an all powerful something, because there could always be something more powerful out there that we haven't discovered yet. So I'd be willing to grant that there is a really powerful being with testable predictions, but I'm not sure I'd ever grant it's all powerful or was not created by something greater, or those kinds of properties. I wouldn't grant those.
All right. So Josh, if you want to, you can respond to that if you want, but at this point, let's go ahead and do closing thoughts. So take about 3 to 4 or 5 minutes, just share your closing thoughts about the discussion. And then from there, we'll move to Tom. We'll give you the last word as the non-Christian, and then we'll close it out.
Mostly, I just want to say I appreciate the conversation with you, Tom. I feel like this is a kind of productive inquiry. And I feel like one of the problems that I see a lot of times in conversations about worldview is that it gets sort of clouded in kind of tribalism or sort of a competition. And I feel like I resonate with a lot of the things that you say and kind of the way you think. You're a creative thinker. Like you want to just sort of see how things fit together, and you're not just going to like believe something on authority. And I appreciate that. And so really, I just want to just thank you for the conversation and just say that this has been a lot of fun, and I hope we can connect again.
All right, Tom, what are your last thoughts here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Cameron. And I really enjoyed my conversation with Josh. And it was a very insightful conversation, because this is one of the topics I have the hardest time understanding theist position on. I'm talking about the divine attributes and how this all-powerful being is really simple, because that intuitively grinds my gears, because I don't understand that at all. And so hearing your thoughts on it has helped me to work through or help me to better understand the theist position. Still not perfectly clear on it, and love to talk with you again about it sometime. And I definitely love to hear your thoughts on some of the other arguments that you think are indicative of a god. But yeah, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, Josh, tell me about your other argument that you're working on from Philosophy of Mind.
I'm not really quite sure which the construction problem, getting sense from nonsense, that sort of argument. I mean,
yeah,
counting. I mean, there's different arguments about the nature of minds. I mean, one of the things that I think about with respect to the nature of minds is that we have to separate the question of what's consciousness from the question of sort of what explains consciousness. Sometimes those get conflated. But my view is that consciousness is what it seems to be. So when you have a thought, that thought's nature is what it seems to be, and it exists, and it's not something else. So it's not a shape or a pattern of shapes or anything like that. And that the best ultimate explanation of consciousness is going to be in terms of the same category. So we don't have to posit another category without evidence. That would be one kind of argument. I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to.
I think it was something that you like sent me to a blog post on your website. And
this sort of counting argument?
Yeah.
I'm not going to summarize that. It's technical. It uses Cantor's theorem, and
another time then.
We can put a link in somewhere.
Okay, another time. Maybe we'll come back and have another discussion. All right, well, thanks, guys, for coming on. It's late. I need to get to sleep. Got to get to work tomorrow. So thanks for coming on. And again, if you guys want to learn more about what we're doing, don't just subscribe to the YouTube channel. Go to the website, capturingchristianity.com. You can find all of our social media links there, and go ahead and subscribe to our email list there too, so that you can get updates on everything that we're doing. All right, until next time, we'll see you later. Oh, and